Evolution is a natural thing for humankind. 300,000 years have gone by, and our inventions have allowed us to master agriculture and animal production, power the factories, trains, and ships that drove the Industrial Revolution, create liberal democracies and the rule of law, develop medicine and cures for diseases, make knowledge accessible and searchable, learn to work collaboratively in complex organizations, and turn our craft-based economy into a mass market one. Well, today, all these great accomplishments rely partly on services and products provided by companies. Out of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are corporations. They've been among the main enablers of the progress of the last 200 years, which allowed average life expectancy to almost double, GDP per capita to increase by almost 14 times, and the world population to increase by almost 7 times since 1820. But this progress was only possible because of the extraordinary Holocene climate and 10,000 years of unprecedented stable temperatures. And if we damage these conditions, we will not be able to sustain a balanced planet for humans and nature alike. In fact, we are already witnessing the drastic consequences of the damage we are causing to our planet. The biosphere and natural resources are suffering degradation and are close to exhaustion. The average temperature is rising, making our planet hotter and melting the polar ice caps. The levels of air pollution and soil degradation are higher than ever. We are facing extreme meteorological phenomena and unprecedented climate change. There is a huge production of waste due to hyperconsumerism. Public health issues like diseases and superviruses, such as the coronavirus, are becoming more common. But it's not just about the planet, it is also about the people. Although on average we are much better off, social inequalities have never been so shocking. And there are still billions of people living in poverty. The lack of trust in institutions is reaching its highest levels, and there is still so much to do regarding inclusion and diversity. And now what? Back to the Stone Age? Or will the world and companies be able to reinvent themselves, responding to challenges like the commitments we approved in 2015, such as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, or the European Green Deal in 2020? How? By becoming sustainable companies, which requires embracing the 4 Ps. People. In a sustainable world, no one is left behind, and everyone is given what it takes to thrive. Is your company paying the fair price to suppliers and cooperating with the relevant stakeholders? Empowering your workers and giving them the conditions they need and deserve to prosper? Finding new ways of interacting with customers that offer more collaborative and ongoing relationships? Learning how to leverage through our differences, making the most of diversity? Strengthening the impacted communities and committing to action on human rights? Planet. Sustainability requires companies to move beyond a doing no harm mindset to one in which our environmental systems can heal and flourish. Is your company using water, energy, and raw materials in the most efficient way, drastically reducing its waste and investing in new circular solutions? Answering the call for carbon neutrality and paying for the ecosystem services that nature provides? Is your company ready to recognize the planetary boundaries and embrace a regenerative mindset? Profit. We need to reinvent capitalism and reward true value creation. Is your company accounting for and reporting on environmental, social, and governance risks? Stretching its time horizons to the long term? Internalizing its social and ecological externalities? Investing in disruptive innovation that provides solutions to sustainability's challenges? Shifting your business model from selling products to selling services, from ownership to enjoyment, and selling high-quality, durable products? Purpose. Last but not least, a competitive company must be purposeful. Is your company trying to shift from the best company in the world to the best company for the world? Leading with purpose and values, offering its stakeholders a clear and inspirational direction? Committing to a mission that goes beyond the company itself? Is your company transparent about the position it supports? Evolution is a natural thing for humankind. If we were able to achieve all this progress over the last 200 years, we can make the transition towards sustainability and prosper in the next 200. This is the ultimate decade, the decade of action. BCSD Portugal's mission is to help companies face these challenges. Join us. Together, we thrive.
Bom dia a todas e a todos, bem-vindas e bem-vindos a esta Conferência Anual do BCSD Portugal. Desta vez uma conferência muito especial porque celebramos os nossos 20 anos de vida, mas muito especial também porque acabamos de entrar numa década que é decisiva, como sabem, para alcançarmos uma série de desafios relacionados com a sustentabilidade do nosso modelo de desenvolvimento. Antes de ter o gosto de passar a palavra à Joana, e já verão qual Joana, se ela tiver trazido os saltos altos. Tenho o gosto de partilhar uma mensagem que nos chegou ontem, escrita pela mão do Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, o engenheiro António Guterres, que passo a ler. Diz assim: é com muito gosto que transmito as minhas saudações à Conferência Anual de 2021 do Business Council for Sustainable Development de Portugal. Felicito-vos por tudo o que têm feito ao longo dos últimos 20 anos para apoiar as empresas portuguesas na sua jornada para a sustentabilidade. Hoje, mais do que nunca, precisamos do vosso envolvimento. A pandemia da Covid-19 causou estragos nas nossas sociedades e economias. Ao mesmo tempo, o mundo continua a caminhar para uma catástrofe climática. Devemos agir decisivamente para limitar o aumento das temperaturas globais a 1,5 graus Celsius e avançar na adaptação e na resiliência. Devemos também garantir que a transição para emissões líquidas zero seja justa e equitativa. As empresas são fundamentais para que se consiga alcançar estes objetivos. Encorajo-vos a transformarem operações e setores, a definirem metas corporativas ambiciosas e credíveis, a pagarem salários condignos, eliminarem as disparidades salariais entre géneros e trabalharem na promoção de ações governamentais verdes. Conto com o Business Council for Sustainable Development de Portugal para dinamizar e fomentar a cooperação, bem como para aumentar a ambição nos próximos anos. Muito obrigado pela vossa dedicação e liderança. E agora sim, tenho o gosto de passar a condução dos trabalhos à Joana Marques, a quem agradeço muito a disponibilidade para nos ajudar a conduzir este primeiro dia de trabalhos. Eu estarei no hosting, ela no roasting, certo?
Mais pelo convite. Eu não sabia que vinha para conduzir trabalhos. É para isso, vamos já embora, que eu sou a pessoa errada para conduzir qualquer tipo de trabalho. Antes de mais, bom dia, João. Sabe que eu estava com uma grande expectativa, porque me contaram que nos últimos anos, nas últimas edições, o João tinha feito umas entradas triunfais em palco. Isso é verdade?
Em causa própria ninguém é bom juiz, mas sim, é verdade que envolviam drones e cenas.
Sim, coisas altamente tecnológicas, então estava ali numa grande expectativa, mas hoje o João só subiu 2 degraus. Fiquei um bocadinho defraudada, mas tudo bem, vamos ver.
Querer brilhar com a Joana presente, claro, estaria votado ao fracasso.
Agradeço disso, depois de repente estava assim uma grande expectativa e entrava eu a seguir e era muito chato, mas vamos ver se o João daqui a pouco faz uma saída de palco mais triunfal do que a entrada.
Joana, encontramos uma solução de base natural, como se diz na sustentabilidade. Qual tecnologia? Temos um jardim tão bonito.
É verdade, é verdade. Estamos aqui numa estufa, portanto não podia haver escolha mais indicada e falaremos de estufas mais à frente. Bom, antes de deixar o João ir embora, queria lhe perguntar, é a primeira vez que eu estou aqui, acredito que haja muitos repetentes neste evento, o que é que podemos esperar do dia de hoje?
Não, primeiro, já agora só dizer, nós temos a estufa fria, que é uma coisa que não apetece, nós dias de repente arrefeceram, mas contamos com a Joana para dar um calor ao dia e agradecemos muito isso. Também dizer-vos que, o que é que nós temos hoje? Nós temos aqui, eu não vou alongar-me de todo, o Sr. Ministro está com o tempo muito condicionado, mas as empresas aprenderam a gerar riqueza e a gerar lucro, a gerar empregos no século XX. Agora, no século XXI, nós precisamos que elas continuem a gerar riqueza e emprego, mas também que sejam capazes de criar outro tipo de valor, que olhem para os P's de planet, para os P's de purpose, para o P de people, com uma atenção que não deram tanto ao longo do século XX, porque se concentraram mais no P de profit. E é sobre isso que vamos falar hoje. Vamos falar sobre os 4 Ps, o de Planet, o de People, o de Purpose e o de Profit. E depois amanhã, então, como sabem, teremos um dia mais dedicado aos temas dos grupos de trabalho do BCSD Portugal.
Amanhã é sério, portanto amanhã eu não venho. Obrigada, João, até
Obrigado,
já.
Joana.
Queria dizer-vos que para mim é um grande prazer estar aqui hoje. Muitas vezes digo isto e nem sequer é, mas esta vez é a sério. Porquê? Porque esta hora costumo estar a trabalhar, costumo estar sempre na rádio das 7 às 10. Isto foi uma ótima oportunidade para me baldar, acordar um bocadinho mais tarde, portanto em vez de ser às 6 da manhã já dormia e até umas boas 6h30, porque tenho 2 filhos pequeninos, não respeitam os horários das pessoas, mas estou muito contente por estar aqui, faz-me lembrar aquela sensação que tínhamos quando nos baldávamos às aulas na escola. Acredito que nenhum de vocês tenha feito isso e por isso é que estão aqui hoje, aí desse lado, e não aqui como eu a dizer umas parvoíces, não é? Mas acontecia-me isso, não é? Baldava-me para ir, sei lá, às Moreiras com os meus amigos, os maus alunos da turma, e aqui claramente hoje só tenho os melhores alunos de cada turma, pessoas que nunca se baldavam. Há muito tempo que eu não estava numa sala com tanta gente importante. Por acaso estou a mentir, ainda há 2 dias estive no lançamento da CNN Portugal. A CNN finalmente chegou a Portugal, mas aquilo não era bem um lançamento de uma estação de televisão, parecia mais a festa de boas-vindas do João Rendeiro. Eu sei que temos aqui alguns estrangeiros hoje, isto está, aliás, a ser traduzido neste momento, até vou falar um bocadinho mais devagar, se calhar, para ajudar aqui o meu colega da tradução. Como é que eu hei de traduzir João Rendeiro para quem não é de cá de Portugal? É uma pessoa que eventualmente pode ter subtraído algum dinheiro, até indiretamente, de empresas como as vossas. Era um banqueiro, ainda é, mas agora está retirado. Retirado mesmo e não sabemos onde. Então agora está-se a fazer um jogo em Portugal muito giro, que é onde está João Rendeiro. Ele vai lançando umas pistas, sim, isto aconteceu. Entrou em direto num sítio, só se vê os cortinados atrás, e diz, é ao pé do mar. E nós, será o Brasil? E ele, frio. Será o Belize? E ele, também não. Então andamos aqui a tentar adivinhar. Diz também que lá se fala português. Portanto, agora já temos aqui um leque mais pequeno de sítios. Ainda assim, há muitos sítios onde se fala português. Não vai ser fácil encontrar João Rendeiro. O segundo motivo pelo qual eu estou muito feliz por estar aqui é o facto de irmos falar, entre outras coisas, de ambiente. E acho que foi por isso que me convidaram, porque eu percebo muito de ambiente, mas é mais de mau ambiente. Eu sou muito boa a gerar mau ambiente, é isso que vou tentar fazer aqui ao longo do dia, comentando as intervenções dos oradores, mas não quero que também se sintam pressionados com isso. Eu não conhecia, até há bem pouco tempo, tenho que confessar, o BCSD Portugal, e é natural, porque eu movimento-me mais, aliás, basta olhar para mim para perceberem, movimento-me mais no mundo dos pobres, não é? Portanto, estas pessoas que são responsáveis por 10% do PIB nacional, eu não conhecia. Estou hoje muito entusiasmada por finalmente conhecer. São, portanto, vocês que andam a levar Portugal às costas, o que explica algumas escolioses que já se vêem por aí. O BCSD é uma associação sem fins lucrativos, que agrega e representa mais de 130 empresas de referência em Portugal, que se comprometem ativamente com a transição para a sustentabilidade. Isto é tipo maçonaria, mas em bom, não é? Foi o que eu depreendi daqui, ajudam-se uns aos outros e tal, mas... Este evento encerra as celebrações, como dizia o João, dos 20 anos do BCSD Portugal, portanto eu estou a contar que haja bolo no fim. Foi essencialmente por isso que vim, mas tem que ser um bolo sustentável, obviamente, que é o quê? É um bolo que é tão bom que não sobra nada, é um bolo contra o desperdício. O mote para o dia de hoje é precisamente sustentabilidade, desafios para a década 2030, que vai ser decisiva não só para as empresas, mas para as pessoas e para o planeta, numa altura em que a maioria das pessoas, agora meio de novembro, está a pensar o que é que vai fazer no próximo ano, não é? Aquelas resoluções de ano novo, deixar de fumar, começar a ir ao ginásio, aquelas coisas que até 5 de janeiro cumprimos e depois nunca mais falamos delas e só passado um ano. Eu acho incrível que já estejam a pensar em desafios para uma década inteira. Admiro essa vossa organização, para mim não dava. A verdade é que esta década que agora começa é de facto decisiva. Aliás, eu hoje, antes de sair de casa, disse aos meus filhos, a mãe vai só ali ver como é que vai ser o vosso futuro e já volta. Vai demorar um bocado mais, mas pronto. Eles neste momento devem imaginar que eu estou, sei lá, com a Maia a lançar umas cartas, mais uma vez para estrangeiros, não é? Já tentei explicar rendeiro, Maia, o que podemos dizer da Maia? Tem umas unhas muito grandes e vê o futuro, não nas unhas, mas nas cartas. Aqui acho que ninguém tem bola de cristal, não é isso que se pretende, não é adivinhar o futuro, é perceber como é que nós podemos fazer parte disso, ser uma parte ativa para ainda transformar o futuro. Já falámos aqui dos tais 4 Ps, portanto, paz, pão, povo... não são estes, desculpem, isto é outra coisa também. É People, Planet, Profit and Purpose. Vamos falar disso, da diversidade e inclusão social, dos limites do nosso planeta, porque existem e estamos a sentir que estamos a forçá-los um bocadinho. Profit, não vou explicar explicar, à partida vocês sabem melhor do que eu o que é, e purpose, que tem a ver com os valores, precisamente. Vou adicionar só 2 P's antes de me ir embora, que vamos ter aqui hoje também muito presentes, é o P de pertinência, conto com todos os oradores para isso, e o P de parvoíce, vim eu, pronto. Está assegurado, não se preocupem com essa parte que eu trato. Até porque eu não sei nada disto, eu vim aqui essencialmente para aprender e, portanto, estou muito ansiosa já por ouvir o nosso primeiro orador. Não sei se sabem de quem se trata, eu vou dar-vos uma pista. O que é que eu posso dizer? Ele fala muito em energias renováveis, claro. Fala muito de lítio, fala muito do fim do carvão, fala da natureza, dos animais. Não é quem estão a pensar. Os portugueses ouvem animais e natureza e pensam logo, não é uma pessoa que tenha estufas, que eu saiba. Não tem nada a ver com framboesas, mirtilos, que se saiba. Ainda temos que ir apurar, mas acho que podem confiar. É o Ministro do Ambiente e da Ação Climática, João Pedro Matos Fernandes.
Eu agradeço muito o convite, muito bom dia a todas e a todos. Peço desculpa por ter um tempo tão comprimido, mas tenho mesmo que estar na Assembleia da República daqui a bocadinho, assim me mandaram. Muito bom dia a todos e muitos parabéns por estes 20 anos do BCSD. O BCSD entendeu, antes de muitos, aquilo que hoje ainda não é entendido por todos, mas é cada vez mais. O BCSD entendeu que a economia e a sustentabilidade não são mesmo faces opostas de uma moeda. Objetivamente, a economia tem que crescer neutra em carbono, a economia tem que crescer regenerando recursos, a economia tem que crescer cabendo dentro dos limites do sistema terrestre e, por isso, os grandes investimentos, os bons investimentos, seja destas 130 grandes empresas, seja de outras empresas, têm que ser na sustentabilidade. E isto que, repito, não é ainda hoje um lugar comum, é cada vez mais entendido por mais empresas. E é entendido por mais empresas até com um sentimento muito agudo de que quem não respeitar os valores da sustentabilidade, quem acreditar que pode fazer mal durante mais algum tempo, que ninguém vai ver, vai mesmo estar fora do mercado mais depressa do que aquilo que imagina. Isto é válido para todas as empresas, incluindo o setor financeiro. É manifesto que o setor financeiro tem que estar alinhado com os valores de Paris. Que satisfação tive eu, há 10, 12 dias atrás, a ler uma notícia em que alguém dizia, esta história não se passa em Portugal, passa-se no sul da África, em que alguém dizia hidrocarbonetos e gás temos para extrair, já não temos é quem nos empreste dinheiro para fazer estes negócios. Confesso que quem dizia isto ficou preocupado e eu confesso que ao ler isto fiquei muito satisfeito. É este mesmo o caminho que o BCSD traçou antes, às vezes, até de alguns poderes públicos. E este vanguardismo do BCSD é hoje mais importante que nunca num país como o nosso, Portugal, que definiu e foi o primeiro a definir ser neutro em carbono em 2050, também já isto é hoje. Não consigo dizer uma banalidade, porque muitas das grandes economias não fizeram, mas são cada vez mais os países que se comprometem com esta data, maiormente no contexto da União Europeia, e, objetivamente, quando nós queremos e nos comprometemos com ser neutros até 2050, sabemos uma coisa. Isto obriga, assim diz o nosso roteiro para a neutralidade carbónica, a um investimento suplementar de 2 mil milhões de euros em cada ano, 2 bi, como agora se diz, e deste investimento 85% é investimento privado, ou seja, é investimento das famílias, é investimento das empresas. É assim absolutamente essencial esta mobilização que o BCSD faz. Eu já fui CEO de uma empresa que um dia aderiu ao BCSD e sei bem o que me motivou. Aquilo que me motivou na altura foi dar testemunho daquelas que eram, acreditávamos nós, as boas práticas ambientais que tínhamos e poder partilhá-las e construir em conjunto. Mas se olharmos para a lista das empresas fundadoras do BCSD, com todo o respeito por estas mesmas empresas, encontramos essencialmente empresas que tinham uma relação ténue com a questão da sustentabilidade. Eram grandes empresas, boa parte delas empresas industriais, que queriam obviamente comprometer-se com essa mesma sustentabilidade. E cada vez mais aquilo que nós encontramos nas novas empresas e nessas mesmas empresas que foram fundadoras do BCSD é que a questão da sustentabilidade deixou de ser aquela preocupação que também tinham que ter para desenvolver o seu negócio comum, para, afinal, ser um negócio da sustentabilidade, cada vez mais uma parcela relevante do volume de negócios destas mesmas empresas. Este é o caminho. Este é mesmo o caminho. Eu, quando olho para os ODS, costumo resumi-los desta forma. Transforma um problema num negócio. Um negócio não necessariamente no sentido de ganhar dinheiro com. O negócio no sentido de tem que obrigatoriamente existir uma organização e uma forma de controlo e de medida, porque, de outra forma, o objetivo pode ser cumprido numa segunda-feira ao final do dia, mas na terça-feira já estará a ser incumprido novamente. Repito, este negócio pode ser uma organização social, pode ser uma empresa privada também, pode ser uma responsabilidade pública, mas tem sempre que ter uma organização e, indesmentivelmente, o modelo de organização empresarial, ainda que haja vários modelos de organização empresarial, mas sei que percebem a que me refiro, o modelo de organização empresarial é essencial para que estes objetivos se cumpram. Portugal orgulha-se de muitas das coisas que fez. Portugal orgulha-se de já ter reduzido em 32% as suas emissões, desde 2005. Orgulha-se de 60% da eletricidade que produz provinda de fontes renováveis. Vamos chegar aos 80%, que afinal era uma meta de 2030, bem antes dessa data. Portugal orgulha-se de ser um país coal-free, um país que já não produz eletricidade a partir do carvão e é apenas o terceiro país da União Europeia a já ter conseguido essa mesma meta, com uma grande vantagem, é que nós não temos nuclear e, portanto, a responsabilidade e o esforço é maior do que noutros que já o fizeram e o poderão fazer em breve. É este o nosso Estado, é esta a nossa convicção. A convicção de que a economia tem que crescer mesmo com a aposta na sustentabilidade. É isso também que são agora e cada vez mais os sistemas de incentivos públicos vindos do futuro quadro comunitário de apoio, vindos daquele que é já hoje o Plano de Recuperação e Resiliência para esta mesma transformação. Vamos conseguir ser neutros em carbono sem um grande esforço? Não. Posso-vos garantir que não. Não vai acontecer nenhuma epifania numa noite de reis ou noutra noite qualquer que vai fazer com que as emissões desapareçam e todos com bem-estar no dia seguinte. Isso não vai acontecer. Perguntava o filme ali no início se devemos voltar à Idade da Pedra? Também não. Claramente não. Não desejo para mim, para os meus, para nenhum de vós e para nenhum dos vossos, qualquer futuro de ascetismo e de perda de bem-estar, independentemente, obviamente, daquilo que são sempre as opções individuais de cada um. É absolutamente essencial nós conseguirmos recuperar a qualidade ambiental do nosso planeta sem voltar à Idade da Pedra. É esse o nosso caminho, é esse que tem que ser o nosso caminho. Não é propriamente vivermos numa gruta, como a Gruta Bonita, onde a lapinha onde nasceu o menino Jesus, é, muito pelo contrário, investirmos, para dar um simples exemplo, nas nossas casas, por forma a que elas sejam neutras do ponto de vista energético, por forma a que elas sejam neutras do ponto de vista das emissões. Mas, repito, investir nas nossas casas para que isso aconteça e criando riqueza dessa forma. É este, em meu entender, o nosso caminho. De uma liderança que não pode estar na rua porque não tem soluções, que tem que estar dentro das instituições. O BCSD já é uma instituição pelos anos de vida que tem e por aquilo que tem construído, e por isso é essencial que o BCSD não é assuma, porque já o assume, ainda que de forma discreta, seja mesmo um dos líderes desta transformação, porque a transformação em prol de um mundo sem emissões, ou pelo menos um mundo com emissões neutras, obriga necessariamente a um esforço de cada um e à mudança de comportamentos de cada um de nós, obriga a políticas públicas claras que promovam os investimentos certos, mas obriga, muito fundamentalmente, a um enorme esforço das empresas neste caminho e, por isso, muito obrigado pelo que já fizeram e se me permitem agradecer em antecipação, muito obrigado por aquilo que vão fazer. Muito bom dia.
Estou muito impressionada aqui com o Sr. Ministro, que não precisou de um único papel para dizer estas coisas todas. E eu, para dizer parvoíces, venho aqui com rascunhos, não é? Portanto, assim se vê. As pessoas chegam a ministros e outros não. Bom, muito mais espantada ainda fiquei por ouvir que nós atingimos uma meta antes do prazo, não é? Antes do tempo final. Isto não é nada português, é das coisas menos portuguesas que já ouvi. Nós temos este hábito de deixar tudo para a última hora e entregar tudo fora de prazo, mesmo que depois haja multas e tal. Não nos importamos, é uma maneira de viver. Impressionada também por ver que o Sr. Ministro não fez aquelas promessas. Às vezes acusamos os políticos de fazerem promessas, não é? Prometerem mundos e fundos, sabendo que não vão poder cumprir, e avisou-nos já, não vamos ser neutros em carbono, mas vamos fazer mais um passo e outro para lá chegarmos. Chamo agora ao palco João Castello Branco, que vai apresentar-nos o primeiro Keynote Speaker do dia. João Castello Branco, acredito que já conheçam, mas é o presidente do BCSD Portugal. Um aplauso, por favor. Bem-vindo, João.
Muito obrigado, Joana. Muito bom dia a todos. Enfim, o Sr. Ministro já não está aqui connosco, mas eu queria começar por lhe agradecer a sua participação na abertura desta conferência e as palavras de desafio e também de apreço pela atuação do BCSD com que nos brindou. Portanto, começar por dar as boas-vindas a todas e a todos a esta conferência de sinalização e celebração dos 20 anos de atividade do BCSD em Portugal. Ao fim destes 20 anos, confirma-se a importância da nossa missão, do motivo que levou um grupo de empresários portugueses a proceder à fundação do BCSD Portugal. Recordo que o nosso primeiro presidente foi Belmiro de Azevedo, um empresário com uma visão de negócios exigente e progressista, que em conjunto com líderes empresariais como Álvaro Barreto, Manuel Ferreira de Oliveira e outros, lançaram o BCSD Portugal. Hoje, não restam dúvidas de que, a par da transição digital, a transição para a sustentabilidade será o principal vetor de transformação das economias, dos modelos de negócio, das sociedades e dos nossos estilos de vida ao longo do próximo século. Todos reconhecemos que o modelo económico em vigor, o mercado livre e a globalização trouxeram ao mundo um enorme valor, permitindo tirar da pobreza largas faixas da população, criando emprego e oferecendo às pessoas os produtos e serviços necessários para poderem usufruir de um bem-estar crescente. Contudo, também não há dúvida que há uma pressão não sustentável sobre os recursos do planeta. Há externalidades climáticas e ambientais. E há tensões sociais que resultam desta procura de crescimento e desenvolvimento e de resposta aos novos consumidores que dele emergem. E estas tensões levantam questões inadiáveis. É fundamental conseguir um modelo de desenvolvimento que seja compatível com as exigências prementes da sustentabilidade do planeta. Este é o grande desafio para todos nós. A resposta a este desafio tem que vir de muitos quadrantes: da sociedade, das instituições e governos, dos mercados financeiros, mas também e sobretudo das empresas. O setor empresarial tem que estar no centro da solução. A sociedade responderá às ofertas que lhe forem apresentadas e os Estados poderão condicionar o terreno de jogo e aportar apoios. Os mercados de capitais certamente vão redirecionar os seus recursos cada vez mais em função das exigências de sustentabilidade. Mas, em última instância, sem a capacidade das empresas se reinventarem e encontrarem novos modelos de produção e negócios sustentáveis, não há solução para esta equação. Na verdade, não existe nem nunca existiu uma incompatibilidade real entre a geração de valor económico e as preocupações ambientais e sociais, entre o stakeholder acionista e os restantes stakeholders. No longo prazo, estas diferentes perspectivas não podem senão coincidir. Dito isto, é claro que existe um enorme desafio de transição, um desafio de horizonte, de compatibilizar as necessidades de competitividade e desempenho no curto prazo com os investimentos significativos que têm que ser feitos nas transições climáticas e ambientais, bem como em mitigar os impactos sociais de um modelo de desenvolvimento económico muitas vezes desigual. É por isso, claro, que o governance das empresas tem que ser capaz cada vez mais de integrar estes dois horizontes e de fazer suas as exigências de todos os stakeholders da empresa e do planeta, sem concessões nem compromissos. Foi por isso que o BCSD Portugal começou em 2001 com 36 associados fundadores, com a missão de ajudar as empresas portuguesas na sua jornada para a sustentabilidade. Destes 36 associados, 19 ainda são associados atualmente e a todos eles uma saudação muito especial neste dia. É por isso também que neste momento temos 134 associados que representam em conjunto cerca de 10% do PIB português e que estão aqui neste momento largamente representados. Muito obrigado pela vossa presença também. Vivemos numa década decisiva e por isso mesmo escolhemos como tema para esta conferência os desafios da década 2020-2030. Por estarmos cientes de que temos apenas 10 anos para alcançar compromissos internacionais decisivos para uma mudança de paradigma, incluindo os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da Agenda 2030 das Nações Unidas, do Acordo de Paris sobre o Clima e do Pacto Ecológico Europeu. Durante os próximos anos, as empresas terão que assumir compromissos cada vez mais exigentes e de acelerar de forma significativa a sua transição para a sustentabilidade, nas dimensões ambientais, sociais e de governance, reinventando-se e encontrando novos modelos de negócio acordes com estas exigências. No final, há uma certeza que todos podemos ter. A empresa do século XXI será seguramente muito diferente da do século XX. Esperamos que esta conferência, ao longo dos seus 2 dias, contribua para aportar pistas e apontar caminhos para esta transformação. Agradeço a todos os presentes, bem a todos os que estão a seguir online, e em especial aos oradores que aceitaram o nosso convite para nos ajudarem a debater os desafios e as prioridades para esta década. Por fim, recordo desde a sua gênese o BCSD Portugal faz parte da rede global do World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, com sede em Genebra, razão pela qual o Keynote Speaker de abertura da conferência será o CEO do WBCSD, Bakker. O Peter já há cerca de 10 anos que lidera o WBCSD, sendo hoje em dia uma referência mundial nesta temática pela sua capacidade de impulsar a ambição global e das empresas associadas do WBCSD na direção de um planeta mais sustentável e de uma sociedade mais equitativa. Peter, thank you very much for being with us here today and sharing your perspectives on the challenges ahead for all of us. Thank you very much.
Bom dia. It's amazing to see so many people in one room. It's possible. Let's hope it will remain possible in the coming month. So thank you very much, João, for welcoming me here in Lisbon. Thank you, other João, for the amazing work for leading BCSD Portugal. 134 members, that's pretty exciting. And thanks, Joana, for introducing this day and for being the voice of people who need to learn about sustainability, because in bubbles like BCSD, or my bubble, WBCSD, we often assume that everybody understands sustainability, but we need to do a lot of work to bring everybody along on this journey. And that journey for us is Vision 2050, Time to Transform. So what is the agenda for the coming decade and decades ahead to really achieve a sustainable world? And I'll fly around that a little bit today. Fantastic video. I want a copy, João. It's Vision 2050 in pictures. It's amazing. Thanks also for handing out the big book, Net Positive, by Paul Polman. A very good book to read over the Christmas period if you're looking for inspiration on where companies should move. This is me, you know me, that's okay. This is WBCSD. I've said in one of our internal speeches that if WBCSD would not have been invented, and I'll copy that to you, if BCSD Portugal would not have been invented, this would be the time to invent it. It is so needed to have organizations like BCSD Portugal to bring businesses and business leaders together to really plot this journey going forward. And that's, why I'm so pleased to be here. And congratulations on 20 years of BCSD Portugal which is in itself a major achievement. So these are 220 logos of global companies. 5 of those actually are Portuguese companies. The Navigator company, EDP, Sonai, Brisa, and Galp are all on our list, so thanks also for support at the global level for that. We have grown our membership by 32 new members in 2021, and that is just an indication how sustainability is now becoming a mainstream topic in many companies around the world. So we all know we need to step up the game, whether it's looking at science, whether it's reading the newspaper, or just looking at the daily news. The amount of natural events that are happening, forest fires, which I know here in Portugal you suffered severely of, floodings, droughts, massive atmospheric disturbances like last week in Vancouver, all related to climate change. The IPCC 6th assessment report that came out about 2 months ago in the lead up to COP26 gave very stark warnings. It is still possible to stay below 1.5 degrees globally, but we have to act and transform in the decade ahead. So this is not about 2050 anymore. This is about 2022 to 2030. Can we, will we make the transformational changes that we need to keep ourselves safe? That is really what this agenda is now all about. It was your countryman, Secretary General Guterres, who said after that report came out, this is code red for humanity. And those words, you should really let them sink in. This is now such an urgent agenda. And that means for anyone in business that business as usual is no longer viable. Now, economically, it will become more and more risky. And the translation of that in business terms is stranded assets will become a big theme in the coming 5 years. Now, whether it's in energy systems, in transport systems, in built environment systems, we will change to another asset base, and you need to figure out when you change out of what will be stranded assets. Environmentally, it's super risky now, and that's to do with disruptions in value chains, unpredictability in supplies, and the likes. Socially, we are running into the boundaries of what people accept. Inequality is becoming a major topic, and in so many countries around the world, with different faces and different reasons, people are saying that it's enough. This system is not serving all people anymore. We need to be more inclusive. And a very new phenomenon in literally the last 6 or 7 months is that companies are being challenged in their AGMs. And the most striking example of that was ExxonMobil, a very conservative oil and gas company who now has, during its AGM, found 2 environmental activist investors to take a seat on their board. And on the inside of the company now conversations start. More striking even was probably the case of Royal Dutch Shell, the oil and gas company in the Netherlands that has been taken to court, has lost the court cases, and is now mandated by the courts on an accelerated decarbonization pathway. 2 weeks ago, Volkswagen Group in Germany has been taken in a similar case to court. We know from inside information that chemical companies, cement companies, steel companies, glass companies are next on the list of being taken to court. So it is all kinds of risks that are now driving us away from business as usual and accelerate us into a new world. And that means that sustainability is going mainstream. It is no longer philanthropy. It is no longer corporate social responsibility. This is in the core of corporate strategy. This is in the core of corporate governance. So the pressure points on business are completely changing. It is customer demanding different services. It's regulators, like the Minister just now saying, there will be new regulations coming our way. It is shareholders beginning to ask very different questions around climate risks. And there is, of course, the real environmental and social risks that companies should be building into their enterprise risk systems. And that means the questions on the table of boards of companies, on the table of CEOs to make choices, are going to completely change in the next 10 years. The question is, how do I decarbonize my company? How do I get to a nature positive point of view? What can my business actually do towards a more sustainable and inclusive society? We need to find new ways to work across value chains, because it is important, obviously, to make your company sustainable, but if not the whole value chain from raw material to end products is sustainable, we still will not achieve a sustainable world. And that's for business leaders, particularly for the ones who are running listed companies, the biggest trick. It is no longer difficult to say why the company needs to change or decarbonize, or what it needs to change to, a decarbonized company. The transition risk from where we are today to where we need to be 10 years from now, that's going to be the biggest conversation to have with our shareholders, investors, and financiers. So a very, very different and prominent feature of sustainability in boardrooms will be the way forward. Globally, we have the agreements we need. You know, we all like to comment whether COP26 was or was not a success, but actually business does not need a COP anymore to know what it has to do. In Paris 2015, we said no more than 2 degrees, striving for 1.5. In Glasgow, only 2 weeks ago, the world said 1.5 degrees is the ceiling we need to go for. And that is something that all countries in the world have said. I see João wearing the COP26 mask, so you must have been there, João, and many of you were there, I'm sure. I look at COP26 through the lens of, is the glass half full or half empty? If you are a depressed mood, then it's easy to look at it as it's not enough, it's not fast enough, governments are struggling to lead. But if you take a slightly more optimistic lens at what happened there, I think this is an inflection point in the climate fight. There were more business leaders than ever before in Glasgow, not just to make speeches and fly out again, but really on the ground, a couple of days to engage in the conversations. Mark Carney had mobilized what he said, $130 trillion of assets under management, i.e. the capital market players that will integrate climate risks into their investment decisions. We saw lots of positive statements there. So I look at it as the first COP that will no longer talk about the why do we need to change or what does change actually mean, but this was the first COP that talked about how to make that change happen. And that's a mindset where business has a leading role to play. Because business is not about academic studies, whether or not we need to change. Business is about figuring out, finding innovative solutions to make that change happen. So this is our time. And for that reason, we've created Vision 2050. Not to talk about 2050, that is very, very interesting for about 10 seconds, but really to talk about what should business be doing in the next 10 years, the decisive years for action. And for that, we have said we need to simplify the sustainability agenda. You saw it in the film. Even I do some work in sustainability on a daily basis. If you look at the film, it's rather overwhelming what business all has to change. But we say, let's simplify the conversation. There are 3 big global challenges that we need to deal with. The first one is the climate emergency. The second one, the loss of biodiversity or nature loss. And the third one, equally important and ramping up fast, is mounting inequality in societies. Climate is a very, very urgent matter. And just to illustrate that, 1.5 degrees is determined by science as the boundary within which a safe operating space for humanity is possible. I know it's just 10 o'clock here, it's early, not all may be speaking English on a daily basis, so let me say that again. 1.5 degrees is the ceiling within which safe operating space for humanity is possible. Breach through the 1.5 degrees and the safe operating space will disappear rapidly. And that's not to say that the 1.5 degree world will be comfortable. We're at 1.1 degrees warming now, and we see the mess that is building around us, and that will get worse. But 1.5 degrees is the agreed ceiling. To stay within 1.5 degrees, the world, all of us combined, can continue to emit the emissions we emit today for 8 more years, and then everything has to be shut down to zero emissions. Well, I know many of you are involved in the big systems, the energy, the transport systems, and the likes. And you will say that system is way too big to shut down in 8 years. And that's why science-based targets and science-based pathways have been invented. So the world collectively needs to halve emissions by 2030, needs to halve them again by 2040, and needs to get to net zero no later than 2050. So when you hear companies make those commitments, net zero by 2050 or earlier, as we now see, that's what people do, is science-based pathway to stay below 1.5 degrees. So we've created Vision 2050 with more than 40 companies working for more than 2 years, 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries by mid-century. So we're going to grow the population to 9+. We want everybody to have a decent life, and the planetary boundaries need to be respected. But what we've done is saying, what are the key product categories that business provides to society? We've identified 9, and you can see them on the screen in front of us. So these are the major product categories that businesses provides to society. So if we want to create a sustainable society, each of these product categories have to contribute towards it. So there's energy, transport, built environment, all the way down to the food system. For each of these categories of products, we have generated a vision, the long-term vision. So sustainable energy system providing reliable and affordable net zero carbon energy for all is the one for energy. That's great. We have the dot on the horizon. So if your business is in energy or in food or in built environment or in products and materials, you will know what to aim for. But more importantly, and impossible to read on this screen, and that's not the purpose of it, we've created for each of these pathways the vision, the long-term dot on the horizon, the key transitions that that system needs to go through to achieve that vision, but then much more important, and that's the right 10 blots on the slide, what are the actions that each business in this product category should integrate into their corporate strategy? So if you have seen Vision 2050, please bring it to your boardroom and do the check. Are we working on all of these 10 areas in the product category that is relevant to our business? Because by doing that, we will not have to talk about, yeah, we need to decarbonize. No, we have an action agenda that will get us into the transition pathways that we need. So the issue is not just how do we get the engineers to bring up new solutions. That's only part of the issue. And I know there's big debates, will it be innovation and all that will save the world? Yes, we need it, but there is more needed. There is actually a mindset shift needed in all business leaders. Thanks. A mindset shift that is needed in all of us. And we have identified 3 mindset shifts that are needed. First, we need to build resilience in our supply chains. And unfortunately, COVID, the massive global shock that represents, has shown us that if you do not build resilience into an economic system, you will suffer a long tail of consequences. Still, many supply chains today are suffering from the lockdowns that were omnipresent about a year ago. And that type of shocks will happen more. Whether it's COVID or climate or another event, we need to build our systems more resilient. We need to have a regenerative mindset. How can we actually contribute to a planetary Earth system that can regenerate itself rather than just take and consume? And most importantly, we need to reinvent capitalism. And that's the biggest fight that is ahead of us in the next 5 years. And this is not an ideological rant against capitalism. Capitalism works fine, it just needs to be redirected. The incentives in the economy that we create should be different. And this is not Peter from Geneva making a speech about capitalism. This is telling you what is happening around us. So the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is now the norm for corporate governance. TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, will be launched this year and will become the norm for governance on your natural or biodiversity impacts. Capital markets are beginning to ask very different questions. For those of you who joined roadshows, you will have noticed that investors are now on the case of climate change. The biggest news coming out of COP26 that nobody talked about is the launch of the ISSB. You may have heard me talk actually in Portugal in the past saying it's actually the accountants that will save the world. And this is what ISSB will do. So what ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board that will make our non-financial or ESG disclosures based on a set of accounting rules. Just as our financial accounting, clear rules on how you tell the world what you're doing financially, there will be a set of clear rules coming out saying what does the company do environmentally. And that will be driven to a mandatory framework very rapidly so that all companies disclose standard, materiality-based, and therefore comparable non-financial data. And that will allow capital markets to decide which company do or don't I invest in, or which surcharge on interest do or don't I provide when it comes to financing. So the long-term vision here is incredibly crisp and shared by many, that the more sustainable a business is, the lower the cost of capital will become. And that's a trick that is, I would say, 3 to 5 years away. The minute that that happens, the minute that business leaders like all of you figure out that by accelerating into sustainability, I can attract lower cost of capital, that's the minute when the accelerator on the implementation of all the innovations will really get us to where we need to be. So what I'm telling you is, this is no longer just about decarbonizing your building or the car you drive or whatever it is that your business does. We are now really talking about changing and transforming at system level. Obviously, the energy we use, the buildings we use, the food we eat, the transport we may use, but included in that will be financial changes, the ones I just described, but also policy and technology changes. So it will be critically important for all of us to really engage beyond the borders of our company. We need to work closely together with research and development, with innovation, with startups, to understand where the new solutions will be coming and what we can do to help scale those up. We need to work with our investors and financiers to direct financial flows to those new solutions, to help them understand these transition risks. We need to work on consumers to really change their mindset, to nudge them to better choices. That's by far the most difficult part of the journey, we understand, but we have to recognize that it is business that is spending billions of dollars each year advertising products. Let's use those billions of dollars to nudge people to better behavior. And obviously, and it was fabulous to see the Minister of Environment here today, we need to work closely together with regulators, because just visionary leadership, like the ones we have in BCSD Portugal, will not get us across the line. we need regulation that supports the transition rather than disables it. So what does all of this mean for you? I would argue 4 things. First, you need to step back into your own company, make your enterprise risk management system integrate environmental and social risks into your plotting of the future of your own business. See what impact your business has on climate change, on loss of nature, or on inequality. Find out those risks and make plans to avoid them. Secondly, be very clear, bold, and ambitious about the targets you set. If you have not set a net zero target by no later than 2050, you run the risk of being left behind. Soon you will be expected to set nature positive and inequality targets. But more importantly, and actually I want to challenge both Joaos on the selection of the theme of this conference, in which you say the sustainability challenges for the period until 2030, I think of this as the sustainability opportunities for 2030. And that's not a cheap, let's not talk doom, let's talk positive. But in the transformation that the world is going to make, there are so many new technologies, products, services that need to be provided. There are massive opportunities. And I would say, talking about Portugal as a society, what is actually the real competitive advantage that Portugal can generate in this transformation? I was in Norway yesterday, similar group, and there the answer is Norway is going to lead the hydrogen sector. Other countries will say the battery sector or whatever it may be. Think about that. What is the Portugal play in all of this? Continue to engage globally. Next year there will be Stockholm plus 50, there will be CBD, and very importantly, the COP27 will go to Egypt. There we are now in conversations with the Ministry to get a food day in the COP27, because food has so many keys. So let me end here, a minute to go, with again, congratulations BCSD Portugal, 20 years. I think the most exciting period for BCSD Portugal is the 10 years ahead. It's not just for BCSD Portugal, it's for Portuguese businesses, it's for the legacy of Portuguese business leaders, but it's most importantly for the transformation that the world needs. So thank you very much and congratulations again.
Obrigada. Eu acho que todos acreditamos que ali os anos entre os 20 e os 30 são os melhores, não é? Infelizmente já passaram para quase todos nós. Dar aqui um segundo para ficarmos um bocadinho deprimidos e depois avançamos. Não, mas os 30, 40 também são bons e até os 50 e tal, sim. Sempre que ouço falar de emergência climática fico ligeiramente preocupada. Acho que isto qualquer pessoa ficará, não é? Causa-nos uma certa angústia, a não ser que nos chamemos Donald, não é? E se não acreditarmos em aquecimento global, por Donald entenda-se Donald Trump. Embora eu acho que o padre Donald também é capaz de não acreditar no aquecimento global, em princípio são as únicas duas criaturas, digamos assim, que neste momento não estão nada preocupadas com estes assuntos. Já tomei aqui nota dos 3 R's, para mim é triste porque passei os últimos anos a tentar decorar aqueles 3 R's da reciclagem e afinal já estou completamente desatualizada, já são R's novos. Quanto a reduzir as emissões dos efeitos de estufa, acho curioso estarmos a falar sobre isso, onde? Numa estufa. Gosto de imaginar a reunião do BCSD Portugal a decidir onde é que ia ser este evento. Onde é que há de ser? Na maior estufa de Lisboa, não é? Se vamos falar de efeitos de estufa, se calhar é o sítio ideal. Eu agora trago boas notícias, não tem nada a ver com a neutralidade carbónica e aquelas coisas, isso não sei. Não sei se vamos conseguir cumprir antes do tempo, mas trago uma boa notícia que eu sinto que vos vai animar, que é termos uma pausa de 20 minutos apenas. Peço que depois sejam rápidos a voltar e a seguir iniciamos com o nosso primeiro painel do dia. 20 minutos. Até já.
as well as to contribute to the business development and sustainable growth of our clients. Through social responsibility, we work to promote fair and equal development opportunities for all, encouraging employee participation and allowing space for different voices to be heard. Through civic responsibility, we aim to create a shared value in our community, while investing in innovative and inclusive educational projects by allowing students to learn. Through environmental responsibility, we strive to contribute to make Portugal carbon neutral by 2050 by engaging with our people and all of the relevant stakeholders. We are a solid and responsible international leader, and we count on you to join the change towards a more sustainable future.
We are EDP. We are a global energy company going all green by 2030. The planet is facing an unprecedented climate challenge. One that demands action, not words. Our world needs the carbon zero power sector, which can provide clean, affordable, and reliable energy. In 2020, the world raised the bar on climate change, and so has EDP. We have committed to go greener, faster, to build a 100% green company by 2030, combined with smarter and resilient networks, to power sustainable lives, moved by green energy, solar and e-mobility solutions. This is a call for action. EDP is stepping up the group's green positioning by accelerating our growth in renewables, decarbonising our portfolio and retaining a solid balance sheet. We are focused on fostering a truly global organization, supported by agile and resilient teams, a recognized ESG leader in the sector. We want to be the beacon of change, accelerating the energy transition by investing in pioneer projects in generation, new technologies, and digitalization. Committing to a just transition, leaving no one behind. Promoting sustainable and affordable energy for all. We want to be the home of the best talent and leadership, embracing diversity and creating a more inclusive workplace that fosters creativity and innovation. Together as a company and for the world, we are taking steps to protect the future of humanity and believe we not only have a responsibility to demonstrate real action ourselves, but more importantly, an opportunity to set a high bar for the industry to meet. We're playing our part. We're changing tomorrow now.
At Galp, we believe the future belongs to all of us, and we strive every day to develop sustainable businesses, reinforcing our decarbonisation path towards becoming net zero emissions in 2050. By 2025, about 50% of our net investments are aimed at capturing opportunities from the energy transition. We combine a strong environmental performance with industry-leading cost competitiveness, and every year we evaluate biodiversity and water risks. Assuring safety is a priority, conducting human rights assessments in more than 90% of our operations in the past 3 years, including ESG criteria in 100% of our purchases. We channel our people's value, promoting equality and diversity. We are a part of Bloomberg's Gender Equality Index, and we will work on an accelerated convergence to gender parity until 2030. We integrate the best reporting standards and guidelines, fostering transparency in our relationship with stakeholders. Our good practices are recognized by several ESG indexes. We lead the Dow Jones Sustainability Index in Europe and ranking third globally. We believe that sustainable finance will promote sustainable and resilient projects like ours. And financial players, institutional investors, and investment funds will be key partners in this transformation process. We want to be, each and every day, a brand committed to an ethical and responsible performance, creating long-term value for all our stakeholders. Let's regenerate the future together.
I've always been fascinated by time. Until one day I discovered the nature of my fascination. I immersed myself in a forest that made me time travel, and that blended all notions of past, present, and future. I was aware of cork before, but I had never thought about its magnitude. The future is being written today through the perfect symbiosis between nature and technology. The perfect balance between tradition and innovation. Isn't this what we all dream of? I don't know about you, but I am truly moved when dreams are fulfilled, when disruptive ideas are born and the sky is no longer the limit. I have to admit, cork changed me. Because of the change it is making in the planet, not only in the environment, but also in people's lives. It made me believe in the future, a future we can only try to guess. But now I know that this future is being built today. I know it might sound poetic, I don't mind. I have lots of data to back this up. If only you knew cork as I do, you would feel the same. I am pretty sure of that. Amorim, our world is cork.
Por todo o mundo, sucedem-se reações químicas. Das aldeias mais distantes às grandes capitais. A todas as horas, a cada minuto, são cada vez mais. Fazem parte de nós. Geram bem-estar e saúde. Garantem o nosso conforto. Contribuem para a nossa plenitude. Reduzem distâncias, combatem os nossos males e muitas ignorâncias. parte desta química mundial tem origem nas fábricas da Bondalti, em Espanha e Portugal. A química não discrimina. Une pessoas de todas as idades, estratos sociais e nacionalidades, de todas as convicções, géneros ou religiões. Está presente no cotidiano, nesta nossa dimensão. Integra o saber transmitido nas escolas, promove a inovação, estimula a curiosidade, faz parte da nossa imaginação. A Bondalti não faz diferença apenas pelo que fabrica, mas também pela sua postura ética e por tudo o que isso implica. Na economia, distingue-se pela sua importância global. Com as empresas do complexo químico de Estarraja, contribui para a produção nacional. E, com os milhões de euros de exportações de materiais produzidos, geram mais de 3.000 postos de trabalho, diretos, indiretos e induzidos. Nos últimos anos, a Bondalti aproveitou cada momento e investiu milhões de euros em inovação e desenvolvimento. Só desta forma, a Bondalti cumpre a sua missão: criar uma química inovadora que contribua para um mundo sustentável e em permanente mutação.
Ser sustentável é ser responsável pelo ambiente, pela sociedade, para com tudo o que nos rodeia. Os mais de 200 anos de experiência na proteção das famílias e das empresas sustentam a credibilidade do grupo Fidelidade, que tem provado a sua solidez ao estar sempre presente quando as pessoas mais precisam. Criámos estratégias de sustentabilidade nas nossas áreas de negócio para poder dar resposta a questões sociais, ambientais e profissionais e fundir tudo isto no nosso universo. Focamo-nos nos grandes desafios: inclusão social, prevenção em saúde, envelhecimento da população, alterações climáticas, cultura. As pessoas são uma prioridade para a Fidelidade e por isso a nossa preocupação no equilíbrio trabalho-família, no seu bem-estar e qualidade de vida e ainda no seu envolvimento ativo em ações de voluntariado e solidariedade com a comunidade. Na Fidelidade, cumprimos igualmente a nossa responsabilidade social corporativa na área da cultura, apoiando projetos no mundo das artes e promovendo o reconhecimento de talentos. Em 2017, a Fidelidade lança o prémio Fidelidade Comunidade, que tem como missão promover o fortalecimento do setor social através de um investimento na estrutura das instituições que atuem no âmbito da inclusão social, envelhecimento e prevenção em saúde. A Fidelidade é feita de paixões e inovações, de pessoas que se superam. É desta forma, com o envolvimento de todos, que crescemos enquanto grupo. Para que a vida não pare.
I feel that I found a place with a very meaningful mission, a tangible mission that I can see on my daily basis, where I am with a small group of people trying to change the world. I'm really impacting the way I will live in some years' time, and that is really, really amazing.
I see that technology is a key for everything that is related with sustainability and how we will evolve.
I believe that what we do has a huge impact in people's lives.
You know, I think there are lots of roles in the world and lots of responsibilities you could take on as an individual, but when you really sort of deep down in your own belief system, you start to think, what is my purpose? And you start to say, well, actually, could I help the world in a better way? And very much for me, that's exactly why I'm here, because I can start to say, well, actually, the skills that I have perhaps can help the world in a better way. And that's very much what I'm all about. I want to be impactful and I want to see a change in the world that I hopefully have a degree of influence over.
Para alguns, o azul é tudo. Azul bebé, coragem, determinação, o teu Danúbio. Outros vivem o verde ao máximo. Verde esperança, verde futuro, verde de... vai em frente. Há quem siga o cor-de-rosa dos seus sonhos. Há quem viva o laranja, quem viva todas as cores, de todas as maneiras. Porque a tua cor é o que fazes por ela. Preto do branco. Protege-a. A vida não tem que ser cinzenta. Por isso vivemos ao lado das pessoas, tornando o mundo mais seguro, empreendedor e humano. Grupo AGAs Portugal. Juntos por um futuro melhor.
BNP Paribas in Portugal has a new corporate social responsibility strategy. We want to continue to play a key role in the group's effort to help building a better future and establish the bank as the global leader in sustainable finance. There are 4 pillars supporting our strategy: economic, social, civic, and environmental. Through economic responsibility, we aim to support the development of the economy and job creation in Portugal, as well as to contribute to the business development and sustainable growth of our clients. Through social responsibility, we work to promote fair and equal development opportunities for all, encouraging employee participation and allowing space for different voices to be heard. Through civic responsibility, we aim to create a shared value in our community, while investing in innovative and inclusive educational projects by allowing students to learn the skills for the jobs of the future. Through environmental responsibility, we strive to contribute to make Portugal carbon neutral by 2050 by engaging with our people and all of the relevant stakeholders. We are a solid and responsible international leader, and we count on you to join the change towards a more sustainable future.
We are EDP. We are a global energy company going all green by 2030. The planet is facing an unprecedented climate challenge. One that demands action, not words. Our world needs the carbon zero power sector, which can provide clean, affordable, and reliable energy. In 2020, the world raised the bar on climate change, and so has EDP. We have committed to go greener, faster, to build a 100% green company by 2030, combined with smarter and resilient networks, to power sustainable lives, moved by green energy, solar, and e-mobility solutions. This is a call for action. EDP is stepping up the group's green positioning by accelerating our growth in renewables, decarbonizing our portfolio, and retaining a solid balance sheet. We are focused on fostering a truly global organization, supported by agile and resilient teams, a recognized ESG leader in the sector. We want to be the beacon of change, accelerating the energy transition by investing in pioneer projects in generation, new technologies, and digitalization.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Pedimos então retornar aos vossos lugares. Vamos dar início então ao painel dentro de alguns minutos. Obrigado.
Inclusive workplace that fosters creativity and innovation. Together as a company and for the world, we are taking steps to protect the future of humanity and believe we not only have a responsibility to demonstrate real action ourselves, but more importantly, an opportunity to set a high bar for the industry to meet. We're playing our part. We're changing tomorrow now.
At Galp, we believe the future belongs to all of us, and we strive every day to develop sustainable businesses, reinforcing our decarbonisation path towards becoming net zero emissions in 2050. By 2025, about 50% of our net investments are aimed at capturing opportunities from the energy transition. We combine a strong environmental performance with industry-leading cost competitiveness, and every year we evaluate biodiversity and water risks. Assuring safety is a priority, conducting human rights assessments in more than 90% of our operations in the past 3 years, including ESG criteria in 100% of our purchases. We channel our people's value, promoting equality and diversity. We are a part of Bloomberg's Gender Equality Index, and we will work on an accelerated convergence to gender parity until 2030.
Estamos de volta então, temos de arranjar uma daquelas campainhas como há na escola. Vou dar aqui uns segundos até ao segundo toque, não é? Há sempre aquelas pessoas um bocadinho mais... gostam de chegar um bocadinho mais tarde. Mas acho que vai valer a pena juntarem-se a nós, porque vamos ao primeiro painel do dia, que tem a ver precisamente com o primeiro P, de que falávamos há pouco, o P de pessoas, people neste caso. Vamos falar de desafios, quer dizer, eu não se preocupem, desafios da diversidade e da inclusão social. Falo-vos de 3 pessoas que vão estar aqui, uma vai estar remotamente, que também é uma novidade que temos este ano, não é? Nas nossas vidas, há sempre alguém que está a participar remotamente, seja o nosso tio no aniversário, porque está confinado, seja agora aqui o Lars Erik Fridolfsson, são nomes difíceis, que é obviamente do IKEA, ou IKEA, também é uma dúvida que tenho sempre, mas podemos lhe perguntar daqui a pouco. Vamos ter também a Margarida Couto, do Grupo Vieira da Almeida, e presidente da Grace, empresas responsáveis, e vamos ter a Catarina Marques Rodrigues, da RTP, a moderar. Finalmente alguém aqui, neste palco, que saiba o que está a fazer e que tenha alguma dignidade para conferir a este evento. Para já, temos o Jorge Moreira da Silva, diretor de Desenvolvimento e Cooperação da OCDE. Jorge Moreira da Silva, já está aqui. Palmas para o Jorge, para dar assim um certo incentivo.
Muito bom dia. Eu acho que está... eu tenho o microfone de... Eu queria agradecer ao João Castello Branco e ao João Meneses o convite para aqui estar. E nestes 15 minutos iniciais procurarei falar de um tema que está totalmente relacionado com o centro da atividade do BCSD, que é o papel das desigualdades e do combate às desigualdades na promoção do desenvolvimento sustentável. A Agenda 2030, que foi aprovada em 2015, não se pode confundir com uma agenda verde, ou uma agenda de crescimento verde, ou uma agenda de combate às alterações climáticas. Não foi por acaso que no mesmo ano, em 2015, se aprovaram 3 grandes compromissos internacionais sobre alterações climáticas, o Acordo de Paris, depois sobre financiamento ao desenvolvimento, com o Plano de Ação da Addis Abeba, e depois com os 17 Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. O que significa que, se quisermos ser consistentes e coerentes com aquilo que foi aprovado em 2015, não podemos olhar para esta agenda como uma agenda apenas verde ou uma agenda de proteção e de valorização do capital natural. Até porque, como se verá durante as sessões que estão previstas para o dia de hoje e de amanhã, este P de People está totalmente interligado com o P de prosperidade, de parceria, de paz e de, obviamente, o P de planeta. Nós não podemos fazer a conversa, portanto, sobre ambiente e proteção ambiental desligada da situação em que vivemos hoje, que é a de igualdade ou de desigualdades profundas que foram alargadas, exacerbadas, exponenciadas com a crise pandémica. Eu trabalho na OCDE no tema da cooperação para o desenvolvimento. No fundo, o que é que os países ricos podem e devem fazer para apoiar os países mais pobres, enfrentando vulnerabilidades e fragilidades que estão com eles há muitos anos e que estão agora a ser exponenciadas. Reparem que nos últimos 12 anos, todas as crises globais tiveram algo em comum. A crise financeira de 2008, que depois deu origem a uma crise da dívida. A crise dos refugiados, que se iniciou na Síria em 2011 e que teve um pico em 2014 e 2015. A crise climática, que tem hoje sinais evidentes de agravamento. E agora a crise pandémica. Estas 4 crises globais dos últimos 12 anos tiveram algo em comum. Primeiro, alargaram as desigualdades dentro dos países e, segundo, alargaram as desigualdades entre países. Aquilo que está no âmago da nossa discussão é o facto de estarmos num mundo cada vez mais desigual. e os países em vias de desenvolvimento serem desproporcionalmente afetados por estas crises globais. E, portanto, eu não vou fazer uma conversa fácil nesta minha intervenção, eu vou falar de números duros e crus que revelam uma face de uma moeda que tem de ser enfrentada de uma forma corajosa e não complacente. Não pode haver aqui greenwashing. Nós estamos perante desigualdades profundas. Vale a pena recordar que, mesmo antes da pandemia, estávamos perante um quadro muito negro. 800 milhões de pessoas em situação de pobreza extrema. Mais de 800 milhões de pessoas que não têm sequer acesso à eletricidade. Não é eletricidade verde, ou branca, ou cinzenta, ou preta, não têm mesmo eletricidade. Quase 2 mil milhões de pessoas que dependem de lenha para cozinhar. 2.400 milhões de pessoas que não têm qualquer tipo de saneamento básico. 80 milhões de pessoas que foram forçadas a deslocar-se para fugir da guerra, dentro do próprio país, e 26 milhões para outros países. Esta era a realidade pré-Covid. E o que é que a pandemia nos trouxe relativamente a esta situação social? A pandemia atirou para a pobreza extrema mais 100 milhões de pessoas, isto é, aos 800 milhões, somem, por favor, 100 milhões de pessoas que passaram a estar na pobreza extrema só no último ano. É a primeira vez em 30 anos que assistimos a um agravamento dos níveis de pobreza extrema. Temos perda de emprego que é 4 vezes superior à enfrentada com a última crise financeira, a crise de 2008. E sabemos também que, com esta crise, as mulheres e as raparigas estiveram numa situação, ou estão numa situação, ainda mais grave. Nós já sabíamos que a desigualdade de género já nos custava 12 trillion dólares por ano, isto é, 12 bilhões de dólares. Essa é a fatura de não termos igualdade de género. Com esta pandemia, a situação agravou-se, quando sabemos que 70% das pessoas que estiveram na primeira linha na área da saúde e na área da proteção social são mulheres. Quando sabemos que a violência doméstica aumentou significativamente com o confinamento. Quando sabemos que o teletrabalho e a telescola colocaram uma pressão ainda maior sobre as mulheres. Estamos, portanto, perante um agravamento das desigualdades, seja ao nível da pobreza, seja ao nível da pobreza extrema, seja ao nível do desemprego, mas também da desigualdade de género. Agora que estamos numa fase de, teoricamente, recuperação, em que ainda temos que enfrentar esta quinta vaga da pandemia, mas já estamos numa fase de recuperação da economia, também vale a pena terem atenção que estamos perante uma desigualdade nesta recuperação. Nós estamos perante uma pandemia e dois futuros. Uma pandemia que afeta todos, mas que afetou de forma desigual. Países que não tinham nem ventiladores, nem camas para cuidados intensivos, nem testes, nem vacinas, nem proteção social. E agora, nesta fase de recuperação económica, vêm-se sem pacotes de estímulo financeiro e económico compatíveis com as desigualdades que enfrentam. Vale a pena recordar que, na fase da pandemia, nós fomos capazes de mobilizar nos países ricos mais de 400 dólares per capita de pacotes sociais para apoiar as empresas e, em especial, as famílias mais vulneráveis. O valor per capita nos países pobres foi 4. Portanto, 4 dólares per capita de apoio social acrescentado em função da pandemia, 400 dólares nos países em vias de desenvolvimento. A telescola, que se revelou uma necessidade e, em alguns casos, até uma oportunidade, não pôde ser concretizada de imediato. Em termos práticos, o que é que tivemos? Perda média de 6 semanas de escola para os nossos filhos, nós que vivemos em países ricos, e uma perda de 4 meses nos países pobres. Isto é, reparem, nos países pobres, que já tinham problemas sérios de mobilidade social, de acesso à educação, as crianças desses países estiveram, em média, 4 meses em casa sem qualquer tipo de escola ou telescola, enquanto os nossos filhos perderam apenas 6 semanas em média. E nós sabemos o impacto que isso está a ter no seu desenvolvimento escolar. Quem tem filhos sabe que essas 6 semanas pesaram. Imaginem em países pobres com 4 meses. Nós também sabemos que nesta fase de recuperação, quando já se fala de taxas de crescimento de 5,7% em 2011 e 4,5% em 2021 e 4,5% em 2022, se olharmos para as médias, ficamos com a ideia de que o mundo está a crescer e até que está a crescer muito rapidamente, depois de ter batido no fundo, estamos a recuperar, pusemos o pé no fundo da piscina, ganhamos impulso e estamos a crescer. Nada mais falso do que olhar para as médias. Estes países mais pobres, e isto interessa às empresas portuguesas, porque as empresas portuguesas exportam, querem exportar. Uma economia portuguesa é uma economia aberta, depende muito da economia global. Convém termos noção da circunstância em que se encontram os cidadãos, os governos e as empresas desses países. Nós conseguimos mobilizar 16 trillion dollars, portanto 16 bilhões de dólares para a recuperação das nossas economias. Em 6 meses, pacotes de 16 trillion. O valor adicional para os países em vias de desenvolvimento foi de 8 bilhões, o que significa 2.000 vezes menos. Isto é, a ajuda pública ao desenvolvimento aumentou, atingiu o recorde, aumentou 8 mil milhões, 8 bi, de 153 bi para 161 bi. Grande notícia. Um grande aumento, 3,5%, 8 bi. Bom, mas depois olharmos para as continhas dos países mais ricos, chegamos à conclusão que os países mais ricos conseguiram mobilizar para si próprios 2.000 vezes mais do que aquilo que foram capazes de apoiar os países mais pobres. E nesta fase de recuperação da economia, é evidente que os pacotes de estímulo têm um efeito. Coloquem-se, por favor, num país africano que já estava altamente endividado antes desta crise. Portanto, não tem margem orçamental, fiscal, para lançar medidas de aumento da despesa. Tinha uma população pobre, 800 milhões de pessoas em pobreza extrema. Vão lançar impostos adicionais sobre essas pessoas? Viram reduzida o apoio através do investimento direto estrangeiro, ultrapassando cerca de 250 mil milhões de dólares, isto é, 250 bi. Isto é, esses países receberam 250 bi a menos do que recebiam por via do encolhimento da economia global. Portanto, aquela que era uma dimensão muito importante de investimento direto estrangeiro, caiu. O comércio caiu em alguns países 30%, 40%. O turismo, em alguns destes países, em especial países, pequenos estados insulares, caiu 70%, 80%. Coloquem-se, portanto, no papel de quem já era pobre e perante uma crise global se vê na circunstância de depender totalmente da solidariedade internacional que não aparece. Este é o mundo desigual em que vivemos. Lamento dar mais notícias no início do dia, de um dia que queremos esperançoso, mas convém termos noção da circunstância em que nos encontramos. Também vale a pena falar das vacinas. Se nós já tínhamos visto que aqueles países não tinham camas para unidades de cuidados intensivos, não tinham ventiladores, não tinham testes, não tinham profissionais de saúde, não tinham unidades hospitalares, não têm agora vacinas. Os números são muito impressivos. Nós já conseguimos, nos países ricos, onde Portugal se inclui, vacinar com a primeira dose mais de 60% da população, no caso português muito mais do que isso, com as 2 doses 40% da população. O número nos países mais pobres é de 11%. E se formos aos 10 países mais pobres do mundo, que não vou listar, mas é fácil de consultar, menos de 2% da população teve acesso à primeira dose. Portanto, reparem o mundo desigual em que nos encontramos. Nós já fazemos fila para apanharmos a 3ª dose. E nos países em vias de desenvolvimento, nos 10 países mais pobres do mundo, nem 2% da população recebeu ainda a primeira dose. E a grande iniciativa COVAX, da coligação das vacinas, ainda continua em déficit de 20 mil milhões de dólares para vacinar 2 mil milhões de pessoas nos países pobres, para fornecer os testes e os tratamentos que são necessários. Este é o mundo desigual em que vivemos. Já era desigual, hoje é muito mais desigual. Mas isto tem uma consequência económica. E eu estou perante uma plateia de pessoas do setor da economia, da sociedade civil. o efeito do adiamento, do atraso, deste tipo de tibieza no apoio aos países mais pobres na vacinação, tem uma fatura para todos nós. E os números são conhecidos. 2,2 trillion dólares é aquilo que nos custará a todos o atraso na vacinação nos países do Sul, daqui até 2025. A conta é fácil de fazer. Enquanto os países pobres não estiverem com a sua população vacinada, as variantes vão continuar a surgir, a economia vai continuar fechada, não há comércio externo, não há possibilidade de exportar, não há possibilidade de utilizar o investimento direto estrangeiro para alavancar a economia global, para termos as cadeias de valor globais a funcionar a sério e não na situação em que nos encontramos, e isto tem um preço, 9,2 trillion dólares. Metade disso, meus caros amigos, é para nós. Isto é, não pensem que esse custo de 9,2 trillion é para o Sul. Metade desses 9,2 trillion de impacto na economia é sobre os países ricos. Portanto, é uma grande estupidez termos vistas curtas. Não é apenas moralmente inaceitável, eticamente deplorável, mas é também, do ponto de vista económico, uma grande estupidez. Porque não há recuperação económica global enquanto tivermos um mundo divergente. Quando hoje temos uma inflação que está a crescer, quando temos cadeias de valor globais que estão frágeis e sabemos que o risco de fechamento das economias é muito maior. O que é que precisamos de fazer, e agora para concluir, para rematar, porque acho que já estou a esgotar o meu tempo? O menu de opções é muito claro, mas requer liderança política e requer coragem. Em primeiro lugar, precisamos de acelerar a vacinação nos países do Sul. Não podemos olhar para o mundo cometendo o erro de paralaxe, que é olhar para a nossa realidade muito própria, muito concreta, não percebendo que este é o momento da solidariedade global. Reparem, nós podemos falar de ODS, de multilateralismo, de cooperação, de solidariedade internacional, mas um dia vamos ter que ser todos julgados pela circunstância de, na maior crise global desde a Segunda Guerra Mundial, não termos sido capazes de mobilizar a solidariedade que é necessária. Em Portugal ainda temos uma ajuda pública ao desenvolvimento que não ultrapassa 0,17% do PIB, quando o objetivo é 0,7%. A nível dos países da OCDE, a ajuda pública ao desenvolvimento não ultrapassa 0,32% do PIB, quando o compromisso de 0,7% do PIB tem décadas. Se no meio desta crise global não mobilizarmos os maiores esforços, isto não vai funcionar. E, portanto, o primeiro grande desígnio passa pela vacinação. O segundo grande desígnio é o das alterações climáticas e o de mobilizar financiamento para as alterações climáticas a nível global. Nós estamos perante uma grande alhada e vamos falar sobre isso no painel sobre o planeta. Mas a verdade é que não é possível virarmos verde se não virarmos solidários. Isto é, 85% dos pobres no mundo vivem nos 21 países mais afetados pela mudança climática. Mesmo que amanhã decidíssemos fechar tudo, parar tudo, descarbonizar tudo no Norte, ainda assim tínhamos um pequeno grande problema. Os países do Sul precisam de crescer, retirar 800 milhões de pessoas da pobreza extrema, criar condições para ter classe média. E, portanto, 2/3 de todo o investimento que é necessário para chegarmos a 1,5 graus de limite de aumento da temperatura tem de ir para os países do Sul. Precisamos só na área da energia de 1 trillion dólares, portanto 1 bilhão de dólares por ano, para financiamento às alterações climáticas nos países do Sul, para descarbonizar o setor da energia. Aquilo que hoje está a ser mobilizado, só da ajuda pública ao desenvolvimento, são 3 bi. Reparem, estamos a falar de 3 bi de apoio aos países do Sul a energias renováveis, quando eles precisam de 1 trillion por ano. Já viram a dimensão do problema? Sendo que, se nós não apoiarmos, podemos dizer adeus a 1,5 graus. Porque o planeta não conhece fronteiras em termos de alterações climáticas. Nós podemos descarbonizar tudo no Norte e, se deixarmos o Sul sem apoio, em termos práticos isto vai dar ao mesmo. Teremos de enfrentar as consequências da mudança climática. Portanto, segundo grande objetivo, reforçar de forma significativa o financiamento às alterações climáticas. E o setor privado está altamente mobilizado e motivado para isto. Eu tenho tido inúmeras conversas com o João Castello Branco, com o João e Meneses, com muitos dos membros do BCSD, e percebe-se que há um dinamismo, um compromisso de descarbonização, de chegarmos ao tal net zero, mas precisamos também de o fazer com maior esforço de cooperação internacional. Terceiro grande objetivo, e termino com isso, é o alinhamento do financiamento com os ODS. Não basta mobilizar dinheiro, não falta dinheiro. Esta é outra novidade que convém termos bem connosco. Nós temos no mercado financeiro 376 trillion dólares disponíveis de fundos de pensão, de bancos, mercado de capitais. O problema é que só 10% disso vai para a área verde. Portanto, dos 376 trillion, 90% é cego em termos climáticos, em termos de biodiversidade, em termos de capital natural. Só 10% vai para a área verde. Há muito a fazer, esta é uma oportunidade. O dinheiro está lá, existe. Portanto, temos que criar projetos, reduzir o risco, criar condições com reformas estruturais para atrair investimento, para dar estabilidade regulatória, para que quem empreende, quem investe, quem inova, tenha também algum grau de estabilidade e de previsibilidade para poder assumir esse risco. Mas se olharmos para a parte da equidade, ainda é pior. Só 5% dos 376 trillion vai para os países mais pobres, o que significa que temos que alinhar mais o financiamento público e privado com a descarbonização e a proteção da biodiversidade, mas também com a equidade. Investimento direto estrangeiro. Só temos neste momento 10% de todo investimento direto estrangeiro vai para os países mais pobres. Isto é, daquela lista dos países pobres, os mais pobres só têm 10% do investimento direto estrangeiro. Ninguém mete lá dinheiro. Do blended finance, que é esta coisa nova de juntar público e privado, alavancar o público para mobilizar o privado, só 5% vai para os setores sociais e só 5% vai para os países mais pobres. E quando falamos desta coisa inovadora, dos green bonds, dos social bonds, dos SDG bonds, do mezzanine finance, de tudo o que é impact investment, bom, é um luxo dos ricos, porque nos países pobres eles ainda não chegaram a esta grande oportunidade. Portanto, eu concluo dizendo que o quadro é duro, é exigente, mas existe uma saída possível e é a única saída possível. Vacinar, 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 mobilizar financiamento climático e alinhar todo o financiamento com os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Jorge. Percebi quase tudo, mezzanine finance e tal não percebi, mas aquela parte de estarmos numa grandalhada é o tipo de linguagem que eu domino. Chamo agora para se juntarem ao Jorge a Margarida Couto, que é partner do Grupo Vieira de Almeida e presidente da Grace, Empresas Responsáveis, e também à distância Lars Erik Fridolfsson, que é People and Cultural Leader Sustainability do IKEA, ou IKEA. Já vamos perceber como é que se diz, acho que eu tenho essa expectativa, para moderar o debate. A Catarina Marques Rodrigues, jornalista da RTP.
We are going to switch to English now. So hello everyone, my name is Catarina Marques Rodrigues. I am a journalist and also an expert on gender equality, diversity and inclusion. It's a pleasure to be here with you today speaking about all of us. So today we are going to address people and its challenges towards diversity and inclusion. We are going to point out what's missing, what's not going well, but also the solutions we can all work on. So we have a panel of 3 experts here to help us defining what we should do next. Let me start with you, Jorge, after your presentation, to ask you a question. When we were listening to you, we can conclude maybe that developed countries are being selfish. Are not they aware of, the advantages of helping other countries? Is it a question of being selfish?
Well, I think it's a question of to focus on short term. Politicians need to win elections. That's part of the game. So what we need is to raise awareness, to make sure that when voters vote, when taxpayers pay taxes, and when consumers consume goods, that we are aware of reality that goes beyond our backyard. So I think that it's also an issue of lack of awareness. I think that people tend to obviously focus in rescuing and saving our families, our economies, our communities, that's fair, but there is too little knowledge about what's happening elsewhere. So I think that we are dealing with some lack of literacy and knowledge regarding what's happening in other countries. So I would not say that we are being selfish. I think that we are lacking the big picture.
Data.
And you know, for instance, Catarina, do you recall the last time we discussed development cooperation in the big debates, in elections? Are we dealing with a race to the top? So do you see in Portugal a competition between political parties saying, well, we want to raise from 0.17 to 0.3 and 0.7? No, that's not part of the debate.
But maybe it's because we think that those people are too far away, so we are not connected to them. So it's also a matter of connection.
That's the point. So I think that what we have learned from this crisis is that we are dealing with an interconnected world, with a multidimensional crisis that cannot be overcome without solidarity and without internalizing those externalities in our countries. For instance, refugee crisis. You have seen the impact of refugee crisis in Europe. So there was a concrete consequence of our lack of support to developing countries in addressing the root causes of fragility. So if we are not supporting those countries in peace building, in preventing conflict, in supporting those countries, you face the migration crisis. On climate, we know that there will be a consequence for all if we don't support developing countries in climate action. On COVID, we know that if we delay vaccination, we will be impacted in our health and economy as well. So I think that if we can learn something from this crisis is that there is not a global debate, an international debate, and UN, and then that there is Portugal and our neighborhood. No, the things are connected, and we need to bring the global discussions to national politics and to decisions to be made also in our communities.
Let's talk about the Portuguese companies now, because we have an audience of HR professionals, people that work in the companies here in Portugal, or at least for Portuguese companies. Margarida Couto, she is a lawyer and also the president of GRACE. You all know GRACE, of course, but it's a non-profit organization dedicated to corporate social responsibility. It gathers together more than 160 companies.
190 now.
And 90 companies, so almost 200. It was born in 2000. So let me ask you, are Portuguese companies aware of diversity and inclusion? Are they doing what they should do? Or are we not following the progressive pattern that we see globally in the developed countries?
Thank you, Catarina, and thanks to BCSD for this kind invitation to GRACE. In relation to your question, I don't think there is a yes and no answer, because companies are in very different pathways and are traveling at very different paces in very different journeys.
But most of them in a slow pace.
Very slow pace, yeah. And given that this is on the P of the, I mean, we are talking about people, I think this is something that the companies will regret deeply in the future, even more so after COVID, because it's rather a paradox, but the pandemic has put the people more on the center than before, including in the companies, because if companies are not, I mean, during the pandemic, if companies were not concerned about the workforce,
their needs, their mental needs,
they were running real risks. And so people are more at the center of companies now than ever before. And this is very obvious for me in this observation point that I am as a president of a very large, I would say, organization that only represents companies. But there is still a lot of unawareness of what needs to be done.
But what would you say are the main concerns of Portuguese companies now?
Again, I think there's a big difference between large companies and SMEs, and Portugal is mostly SMEs, and we tend to focus on what the large companies are doing. But one common thing, one common concern nowadays is people, because the challenges of this post-COVID, not really post, I mean, we are back and forth, but I think one of the challenges is to deal with your workforce.
But it's like more focused on gender equality, race, LGBT people?
Gender equality, it's a concern. I think not most, but many companies even understand that it is a sustainable development goal. It's goal number 5, so they are incorporating it. But it's more talk than walk. I think this will accelerate, but the fact that the pandemic created other problems focused on the workforce, including mental health, which I believe it's a silent pandemic, because COVID was a very loud pandemic, but I think that mental health is a very silent pandemic. I read in a study that our brains are not prepared to such high levels of cortisol and other stress hormones for so many time. And so many of us don't even understand that we can be on the verge of a mental health problem. I mean, like you and me. Not only the workforce that is over there. So I think this is something that the companies will need to focus on. And that's why Grace just prepared and released a toolkit for the companies to deal with mental health problems in the workforce, because you are only seeing the tipping of the iceberg, but it will emerge, and it will be a huge social problem.
Lars, welcome. You are in Sweden, right?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm in Sweden.
Yeah.
Sweden, sitting at home like many people are doing these days.
So you are one of the experts of IKEA, which is considered, a place of best practice towards gender equality, LGBT, race, belonging, etc. Let me start with a study by a Boston consulting group that found that diverse companies produce 90% more revenue due to innovation. Let me ask you if you see this in practice and how. So how does diversity actually helps innovating, helps creativity, helps being productive?
Yeah, I think for sure IKEA is a global company, as you know, and we, if we take our product development part, we have 9,500 products in our range, and we are product developing everything ourselves. So of course, if we wouldn't have like a diverse team looking into the different aspects of product development, we wouldn't actually be as creative and as successful as we are. So I know in our range company, which is the part where I'm working right now, we have like plus 70 nationalities working there, and we are having our products on 50 markets around the world. So I would say for sure creativity sparks through and is necessary to be able to have the product development at the level we need. Also to be relevant for our customers and for our people out there.
But can you tell me how does it happen actually in practice? So how does having different people connect them in a way for them to be more creative? So why shouldn't we just have people that look alike? Because I'm sure that when people look alike, they have less challenges, they have less arguments, they have less problems, right?
You're so right, Katarina. I mean, it's easy that we think that just having a diverse group makes everything easy, but it is a challenge, as you say, as well. But I think from the point of, if you want to develop a product, and it is good that you see on this product from many different perspectives. If I take my Swedish perspective, I like a light furniture that is very, very light or white and so on. And I've been working in India, and there they said, why do you have so many white products? We need brown products here. And just having the perspective of, aha, there are different views on how we like colors, how we like the function of the furniture and so on. And I also got a lot of questions when I was working in India, they said, well, we would like have lockers on our cabinets, and we didn't have it on ours. So just like simple examples, but you see, it's so important to see things from many different perspectives, because that gives the creativity, and you make sure that you actually deliver a better product. So, yeah.
So yes, and we also have to focus on management, on the leadership teams. So Margarida, let me ask you, when we don't have like diverse teams and diverse people in our company, it's also because the person that says who we are going to hire doesn't have that perspective. So let me ask you this: do we in Portugal have conservative leaders? Are we too used to the man, middle-aged, white model?
Well, let me start with leadership. I believe that at the end of the day, it all comes down to leadership. When leadership decides that something is going to be done, it really gets done. So yes, we have a problem. We have a leadership problem. But this leadership problem is also anchored on a cultural problem, a corporate cultural problem. We need to understand, I mean, things take time to evolve. Too much time, I know sometimes, but they take time to evolve. And most of the leaders that are sitting at the C-level of our organizations, they have been taught under the Milton Friedman doctrine that all they need to focus, or the only social responsibility of business was to create profit for the shareholder. And at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult when you have been a kind of wired to work in a certain direction, even though you are pretty much aware that you need to move to other directions, that it's very, very hard to really come to results. For instance, many companies have declared what are their gender diversity targets. It should not be difficult, because the pipeline is huge. I mean, you have more than 50% of the population is women, okay? So no pipeline problem. It's not a qualification problem. Women in Portugal, and likewise in many at least European countries, are more qualified than men in every qualification rank. And companies struggle, and some of them, they are really intentional in trying to get more gender diversity. And I'm only talking about gender, because at least with gender diversity, we don't have a pipeline issue, okay? With LGBT and refugees and disabled people, you can say, okay, but we have a pipeline issue. We don't have 50% of all of that. You have 50% of women. And still, even though some companies are very intentional, they cannot meet the targets that they have defined for themselves. So it's a difficult problem.
Jorge, you also mentioned in your keynote that you are having talks with the private sector, and that you see that they are very interested in these issues. Are they actually in Portugal doing something, or are they starting to do the first steps, but like, we have women in our company, so we are fine, and that ends there?
Well, I don't want to provide an answer that may look complacent, but obviously we see progress. If we compare what's happening now in private sector, but also in public sector, with what was happening 1 or 2 decades ago, there is a big difference. So diversity, gender equality, it's not just a jargon, it's not just lip service. We can see that there is ongoing transformation, and there is a new generation of youth that is much more challenging the authority and some assumptions. Those that have kids at home, we know that it's impossible to have a conversation about economic models or development without having as a premise gender equality and diversity to be ensured. But I really want to emphasize something, that is, diversity also needs to include other dimensions. Gender equality, it's plus, it's obligatory. I echo what Margarida said. There is a cost on us due to the lack of gender equality. I already mentioned it's 12 trillion a year. Cumulative, it's more than 300 trillion according to the World Bank. So we are paying a price for the lack of gender equality.
And it should be easy to solve.
Yes, because there is a supply, obviously. But the problem is we also deal with other diversity issues that are not so visible in the public debate.
Ages,
such as age, but also the economic backgrounds. We really need to hire people that come from very different economic and social backgrounds. We cannot just hire for our companies to the C-suite, to the board, to the director level, those that are coming from the same economic origins.
Same college, same city, same...
Especially in a country like Portugal, where you need 5 generations to move from poverty to social class, it shows that you really need to do some effort in the private sector, also on recruitment. So I'm leading a directorate, as you know, at OECD, 200 people from different nationalities. So diversity, gender diversity, nationality diversity, it's part of our objectives, but now we also have race, age, and especially economic backgrounds. Because if we have in our companies, in our organizations, something that is artificial and does not mirror the world, we are biased. We are not getting the right picture. So I hope that when we are dealing with diversity, we also go for, not just go to the same universities, recruiting managers from the same universities, from the same economic background, from the same nationalities. I think it's very important to bring this diversity. And I think that managers and businessmen, private sector leaders that we have in the room know that the more diverse your institution is, the better is the result in terms of the impact of the work that you are doing. So diversity is a plus, it's not a cost. So it's not something that you just put in your report every year to look nice. I think that there are already tangible...
You can see the benefits.
No, you can see the benefit. Even João and others that are sitting on the board of companies, they need to attract investment. So it's part of their job, attracting private investment from asset managers. Now, asset managers, they decide on where they put the money, also based on issues such as diversity, but also on the ability to measure the ESG. You have this ESG metrics to value the way we invest and we provide the revenues for the stakeholders and shareholders. This is not possible to do through a complacent approach. And now the figures are quite strong, Catarina. For instance, McKinsey has found that 25% of the companies that goes through ESG metric, they do that because it increases the value of the company. So it's not greenwashing, it increased the value of the company. During the crisis, the COVID crisis, Standard & Poor's made some analysis and concluded that the companies that follow the ESG metric outperformed compared with the others that don't include ESG. So clearly there is a benefit when you integrate the social and environment dimension in your portfolios. But I would say it's impossible to do that just when you invest if you don't have in your own company this kind of diversity and multiple skills.
So we have the numbers, Lars, and maybe you can help us now speaking about how do we start. So in Portugal, by Margarida experience and Jorge experience, we are starting to be focused on gender equality, for example. But how do we start to have a systemic approach? So how do we look for those people? How do we look for diversity? Does it start with the HR teams? Does it start with the management? How should we, create this approach towards these issues always in every part of our company?
I think, as you say, we need to have systematic or systemic approach to this, Katarina. I mean, because it's very important that, and the way we have worked with it in IKEA is that we say there are 3 areas that needs to play together. And the first area is what culture do you have in the company, and in terms of being an inclusive company? What are your values and the culture you are nurturing in the company? So that is the first part. The second part is what kind of competence do you have in the company? Do your co-workers and employees, do they understand what inclusion means? Do they understand how they work with it? Do they understand dimensions of diversity? Do they understand equality? So the second part is competence. And the third part you need to work with is what kind of processes and structures do you have in the company? And why I say you need to work on all 3 areas, because I've seen some companies, they start to say, like, we want diversity, and then they bring in a lot of diversity into the company, but they don't really know how to include that to make a part of the company. And you can also have a system where you have a recruitment, where you actually are working on getting in the right people, but the company is not really prepared to take the diversity that you have created. And Margareta said a lot about leaders needs to walk the talk. So do they nurture a culture to being an inclusive business? So I think it's so important that we see that these 3 parts must work together and that is for me really the starting point. What is the culture in the company? Do we have the competence, and do we have structures and processes that actually supports an inclusive culture, an inclusive way of working?
But how do you actually do that? Do you do like seminars? Do you do some talks about that? So tell us about what IKEA does, so we can pick up some ideas for the Portuguese companies here to do that themselves.
I think first of all, it's good to discuss in the leadership. What is our mindset? What is our mindset about inclusion and equality? Why should we have it? The why question is, of course, always important. If I don't understand the why, you are not really get going. And I would say, to start with the management team, to have a clear view on actually why do we want diversity. And not only diversity, because diversity as such doesn't really move anything. How do we want to include it and make it a part into our business? So that is the first question. And then it comes the educational piece in it as well, as you are into. And then I think you need to decide, when you said, yes, we want diversity, we want inclusion, you need to decide which goals do you set for it and what kind of diversity do you want, and then get acting on that. So I think it's so important that we make this tangible, because these topics can be very, if I say fluffy, but you can put target on it and you can decide to move it. But make sure you have all different parts with you.
There's this
the competence, the structure, and the leadership.
Lars, there's also this say that is diversity is inviting to the party and inclusion is inviting to dance.
Yeah.
How do you invite to dance in IKEA?
Yeah, I think the way we are doing is that we really want to embrace our differences, and we are really interested in our leadership to talk about do you bring to the table? What is your uniqueness? We talk a lot about and advocate for
every employee, of every person.
Employee, yes, and that goes back, Katarina, to I mean, do we walk the talk about that? Do we show it in our actions as leaders and as co-workers? And do we say it in our culture? I mean, 2 of our key values in IKEA is togetherness and lead by example. And I think we need to be quite tough on ourselves as leaders and say, do we really have this culture? Do we walk the talk? And are we inclusive? And do we show that? And of course, you could measure it also through co-worker surveys and so on. Do you think we are inclusive in IKEA and so on, which we measure? So that is some of the tangible things, I think.
There is also a third part, so diversity, inclusion, and belonging. There's an IKEA statement that says, we encourage co-workers to express themselves and question our ways from time to time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's difficult for our employees to question the management teams because we are afraid of something, because we are not comfortable in doing that. How do you encourage employees to ask and to question management without being afraid of being punished, for example?
Yeah. I think I think it goes back to what culture have you created, and it's not what you say you are doing, it's actually what you are showing you are doing, because behavior is, and walk the talk is the only thing that counts, right? So you can say anything, but if you don't show it, it doesn't help. And I think it goes back to this, that we nurture a culture and where people can feel that I have the right to say what I need to say, and that I'm welcome to do so. And we encourage that a lot, and through our way of talking, through our way of being to each other, I would say. And this takes some courage from the coworker, it takes some courage from the manager as well. But this is the way we want it. So I think to really be open to each other and dare to speak out and showing that you have this, if you talk about psychological safety in the company.
So Margarida, Lars is talking about culture. How do you foster a culture of inclusion? So speaking about the Portuguese reality, you know, many people have contracts that are not permanent, for example. We have some people that, even though they work and etc., they don't have like a really big income. Is that something that can not help to foster a culture of belonging, of speaking up, and then a culture of inclusion?
Well, yes. First of all, and going a little bit back to what Lars was saying, and also to what Jorge was saying, I think it's clearer and clearer, even now with these studies from very reputed institutions, that diversity and inclusion, it's not only a social or an ethical thing. And it would be enough if it was only a social and ethical thing. But it's a business issue, because it is about competitiveness. And of course, companies want to remain competitive, okay? And if they want to do so, they have to get it right, this diversity and inclusion subject. And of course, normally, the culture does not help. That's mainstream. Because, I mean, culture, you don't change it because you decide to change it. You need to plan it, and you need to follow a plan. Because
a strategy, so you need to actually create a strategy.
Yes, because a goal without a plan is just a wish. And normally, companies, they wish a lot, but they plan very little. And so, in the first day of the year, they wish that they will have 30% of women on the board, 2% of disabled people on the workforce, 10% of other cultures, whatever. But then they do not follow a plan, and then they get disappointed, because at the end of the year, they look to the figures, and it didn't play out as they wanted it to. And this creates frustration. And frustration does not help to go on with the same efforts. And so it's a negative cycle.
Jorge, we also have to focus on Generation Z, so people that were born from 95, 96, so they are now 25, 24, 26 years old. They are really focused now in gender equality, diversity, and inclusion, so we see plenty young people embracing the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and we also have some numbers about the Generation Z. So according to a McKinsey study, 75% of Generation Z consumers will boycott companies that discriminate against race and sexuality across advertisement companies. So we see people out there, and we also have the numbers. Are companies actually thinking about this in a serious way? Because we have to worry about our workforce, there is going to be young people as well, but also about the people that buy our products, that embrace our organizations. So are we focused on these generations, or are we, again, focused on the businessman on a suit, no offense? But are we only focused on this model until now?
Well, good point. I think that if you look to what happened in the last decade on activism, you have observed a big change on the nature of these social movements. rather than driven by NGO or unions or by political parties. You have seen that this social activism was driven by causes and suddenly went from one country to the global level. The Fridays for Climate with Greta Thunberg.
Fridays for Future.
For Future, sorry.
Yeah.
The Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, as well as the
Time's
Occupy.
up.
The
Yeah.
Occupy, everything started with the Occupy after the financial crisis. You have seen that there is no ideology behind it.
Oh,
There
and
is no organization.
Also against precarious job titles, so being precarious in our job, also against that.
So what this has in common is the fact that is driven by some sense of discomfort regarding inequalities and the fact that ideology, conceptualization, systematic thinking is not able to fix some of these obstacles. So I think it's really good. If I was in a board of a company, I would take this seriously. I would say this can be really game changers. The changes we are observing on the consumer patterns are fostering change much faster than we have expected. It's not by accident that we are now excluding coal from energy. You know, I've worked on climate for many years, more than 20 years. And normally we avoid being focused in one technology or in one specific element of the energy mix. So we set targets, objectives, and then it's up to countries to decide what's the best technology, the best energy mix to comply with the climate targets. But suddenly we realize that this systematic approach is not sufficient. We have to be a bit more biased, focusing in excluding something that is toxic. And coal, it's toxic. So you can see that we went beyond a traditional approach on multilateral discussions on negotiations on climate towards an approach that compatibilizes these targets and policies approach with excluding technologies. The same is happening when people consume. So I think that there are some technologies, some products, some services that are becoming toxic, and especially for companies that are listed, they know that this change is unstoppable. So I think that the youth movements, the capacity to address change, to embrace diversity, to embrace sustainable development is, in my opinion, the big game changer that we are facing.
And they are already pushing some changes in companies and in the campaigns that they are doing. So Lars, we are talking about the advantages, and we all, by this time now, we all know them, but there are also some challenges. So let me ask you, was everyone into it inside the company always? Or were there some groups that said, oh, this is not important, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to embrace the campaign this or that? Why do we have to participate in this activity? Tell us about the challenges, because our companies here are also facing them. So, and how also did you deal with them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not everything of this is easy, and we are talking about behavioral change. We are talking about us changing perspective and also changing our attitude to things. And we also need to deal with our unconscious bias about things. And so to start with, I would say that today I think the awareness is there, like George said right now, and you said about what the environment and the communication around the media is talking about, that this is on, everybody says on an intellectual level, yes, of course, we need to be better on inclusion, diversity, and so on. Then I feel an obstacle for many of us is that you really need to dare to challenge your own perspective of things. Because true diversity means you meet a person that has a truly, in ways, different ways of viewing things than you have. Because that is really what diversity is about, right? Somebody who comes with something that you don't have yourself. And then you need to be open and challenge yourself in this. And I think we as leaders must dare to be courageous in this. For example, when it comes to recruitment, we said in IKEA, yeah, we must have much more younger leaders. We have too few leaders that is below 30, and maybe you have in your companies as well. And we said, yeah, of course. Everybody said, yeah, we want young leaders and managers. And then when you come to the recruitment, how many do you recruit? And there we see we are getting a bit scared and go for, let's take the senior one because that's more safe. But we need to challenge that. And for me, it goes back to what did we decide? What kind of goals did we set for young leaders? Did we say 20% young leaders? Why are we not living up to it? So be very clear on what the goal was, why we needed it, and also dare to take the actions to it. Because otherwise it will not happen. So that is a very important part. Then I think with the unconscious bias is also a very important thing. We all have a tendency to take decisions on our first impressions and don't really challenge our biases as well. And I think that is another important part to work with as well.
So tell us about also an example inside the company Force, something that you were, really into it, but there were some people arguing that that was not important. And who were they? Like, what kind of characteristics or something? And what were their reasons to not be approving that?
I think when it comes to some of the situations where you talk about, George said you have many types of diversity, right? You can either have diversity on age, you can have it on nationality, you can have it on gender, and so on. And then I think there are some dimensions of diversity that is more challenging. Like talk about religion, different religion, talk about race, talk about different nationalities. It becomes value-based in a way that makes you a bit nervous. If you say like, we want Christians, Muslims, we want Jewish people, we want Buddhists, whatever, you start to, there I can sense that when we're coming into fields where our knowledge is not that high, it is harder to talk about it, and you get a bit nervous actually as a leader. It doesn't mean that you don't want it, but there I can see some resistance due to lack of knowledge. Going back to that, we said we need to make ourselves competent in these questions. I think gender, quite many has a view and are quite clear on that is good. Age, we can see now, quite good. And some of these things, that is quite simple. But when we're coming into these more tricky ones, sexual orientation can also be that one, where that is quite sensitive to talk about if you are not knowledgeable about it. So, and that creates in one way a resistance, of course.
Yeah, so Margarida, about these issues like religion, LGBT and etc., is it still hard to explain and to understand in Portuguese companies why is that important? Because sometimes people say, oh, that's not important because we see everyone as equal. So it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, if it's black or white, everyone for us, it's about competence, it's not about characteristics. Do we still have this saying in Portuguese companies when they are asked about why don't they have a diverse workforce?
Well, in the first place, I don't think that people are malevolent. I mean, leaders or whatever. The reasons why sometimes things go wrong are non-intentional. As Lars was saying, we have, and when I say we, I include me, we all have unconscious bias. And I also, even in relation to gender diversity, I also have unconscious bias, okay? It's a cultural thing. I regret that.
About a leader, like what a leader looks like.
And what a woman should do, and what a man should do, and why it's more okay than it is the woman that takes the kid to the doctor, and if it is a man that asks an allowance to go to the doctor with the kid, the leader of that particular worker would probably say, but don't you have a wife? And he does not say it to be meaningful. I mean, it's just that we have this unconscious bias. We have this in relation to gender. We have this in relation to sexual orientation. We have this in relation to disabilities. There's a lot of bias and conscious and lack of awareness, for instance, in relation to disabilities. Now we have a law in Portugal. I think companies are not, I mean, they are maybe aware, but they are not working on that, and then it will hit them hard. But we have a law imposing quotas on people with disabilities. And companies feel very uncomfortable with the idea of having to hire people with disabilities. And they probably look to that as a tick-in-the-box issue. I mean, now this is about compliance, I have to do it, and so where do I find these people, how do I do it? It's not like that, because as Lars was saying, if you hire a disabled people, but then you don't include this person in your workforce, it's even worse than let these people in the comfort zone they were in. And for us, for instance, at the level of Grace, as we have a very strong focus on the S of the ESG, and we believe that S is the new green, or we hope that S is the new green, because now people are more at the center. One of the needs that we have identified for our associates, it's the need, for instance, to have a toolkit on how to integrate people with disabilities, because it gets you uncomfortable. It simply does, and you have to overcome it. And you have to show that those differences, in the beginning they may be difficult, but at the end of the day, they have a positive impact in your own company, in your own team. There are studies.
They also have ideas to share. They also have, so they are much more than the disability that they have.
Exactly, and they create a positive impact in the team that includes this person with disability. Well, first of all, you start complaining about a lot of things, because normally you complain about everything. I mean, I'm underpaid. I work too many hours. My boss is that, whatever, and then you look at your side and you see a person with a disability that has to overcome so many difficulties every day just to be there, and she or he is so happy to have a job that you start to think, well, maybe my problems are not real problems, okay?
It creates empathy.
Yes, it creates empathy. It creates an enormous team spirit. I mean, it's amazing the way that teams with disabled people function better. With a broken piece, apparently. It's not a broken piece.
Now let me ask you for your questions. We have 10 minutes, so we want to hear about your questions, anything that you want to ask our guests here or Lars in Sweden. We have someone with a mic, so just put your hand up.
You can even make difficult questions.
Yes.
You see, leaders
are
shy.
Okay, we have one here, please. Yeah, here in the front.
Hi, I have a question. I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you. I'm Marcello Palazzi from the B Corps. One question is, there is actually a lot going on about women-led businesses. A lot of startups now. I am in Amsterdam. We have EquiLeap, which is a fund only for women-led companies. So could you comment a little bit on, that's really actually also a solution, to have more women set up their own companies, and even if it's a women-led with majority of women, that's okay. Do you have experience of this? What do you think about it? Thank you.
Margarida?
The question is directed to the panel?
Well, maybe you can do it. I mean, I think you were very, very good.
Because you are the subject of the question, you know? So you are a woman, you answer this question.
Catarina, sorry, just for interrupting you. We'll close with the answer to this question, okay? I'm sorry for being so rude. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think we are way beyond that. I would already feel happier if at the Portuguese level we had companies with more women at sea level. And if you look at the Portuguese landscape, even though we have a quotas law for listed companies, we still do not have a female leadership spread away, and even less so when it comes to women-led companies. I think we have like 2 or 3. They are always the same. They are always invited to speak about their experience because they are the only CEOs that are women. I think there are now 2 or 3 in relevant companies. So I think we have to start a bit behind. Thank you. And I'm sorry there's no more time for questions.
Do you want to comment, Jorge, briefly?
Well, just in 1 minute, because we did not touch on something. Lars mentioned something very important, that was you need leadership, you need culture, and then you need systems. And within systems, I think that targets are very important, that was already mentioned, but codes of conduct is also something very important. Abuse of power, sexual harassment, issues that undermines the diversity, the level playing field in companies is fundamental. So we really need to protect victims.
To have instruments.
We need to have instruments to protect whistleblowers, to track what's happening. So I know it's a very difficult conversation, but I think it's impossible to discuss diversity just when you recruit and then you don't take care of the right systems and conduct and code of conduct to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Margarida. It was a pleasure to be with you. We have many ideas shared here. I hope you all took notes. And of course, we have our speakers available to talk to you. So thank you so much for this moment. And I hope you all conquer what you want for you, for your workforce, and for the world also.
Obrigada.
Creio que não. Agora sim. Olá, pela 7ª vez, mas agora já está. Eu vou tentar ser o mais rápida possível, até porque já percebi que o João Meneses é implacável. Se alguém demorar um bocadinho mais, portanto estou com algum medo, vou ser muito rápida a apresentar-vos o próximo orador, que vai dar início também ao próximo painel. Passamos para o segundo P do dia, não é? Falámos em 4 Ps, vamos agora ao P de Planet, tem a ver com o nosso planeta e com os seus limites. Vamos falar de respeitar os limites planetários com Miguel Araújo, não é aquele dos maridos das outras, em princípio, também se for, não interessa agora aqui para o caso. É professor catedrático de Biogeografia na Universidade de Évora e junta-se agora a nós. Miguel Araújo.
I was asked to speak in I'd like to thank the organizers, João Castello, Branco and João Meneses, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a slightly different audience than I'm accustomed to. And I was asked to talk about natural capital, sustainability, and these sort of issues. I gave a very boring title, that one you have in the program, and I decided to change it slightly. A few minutes ago, a few talks ago, there was reference to the COP26. Everyone knows about the COP26. Some of us have been there. And even people on the street paid attention to what happened in the COP26. I was approached these days by several people from the street, regular people, asking me with an anxious voice about outcomes, what was my opinion about the COP26. And regardless of how you position yourself into this pessimistic, optimistic side that was mentioned before, there is no doubt that it had an impact on people. Now, 2 weeks before the COP26, there was another COP, COP15. Does any of you know about it, COP15? Yeah, well, a few hands, and I'm sure there's a good bunch of hands, but nobody asked me on the street what happened in the COP15. COP15 was about biodiversity. And one of the reasons why biodiversity is not in the public discourse as climate change is, of course, climate change has that element of danger that people feel it very easily, although life on Earth, if it disappeared, it would have a tremendous impact on people. But one of the reasons why it's difficult to bring it to the public discourse, it's because it's a complicated issue. And not just, do you know the difference between complex and complicated? Biodiversity is both complex and complicated. But we scientists and we people that work on biodiversity have somehow failed to convey the complex side of the complication. And I'm going to explain that just in a minute. Complicated is a system with many variables. And biodiversity has many variables. And when we people talk about biodiversity, there's different elements. We can talk about rarity of species. We may value species richness or rare species or threatened species or cuddly species. People want to invest in the pandas, but they're not so willing to invest in nematodes that generate the services that create new soil. Minhocas, right? People don't like minhocas. Nobody wants to spend money on that, on worms. And so there's this conflicting discourses. Whereas climate change, we don't want to go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. And when it's like 50 degrees, we're all melting, our brains are melting. We all understand that very easily. In biodiversity, we have failed to convey a simple message about it. And yet, what I'm going to talk today here is try to convince you that there is a currency of biodiversity that we all understand. And it's as easy to understand as money. So, complex systems, it's a system that is complicated, that has many variables, but has general properties that make it understandable. So, for example, the markets, they are also complicated. Each one of us is an element of this market. We all have our preferences. We all consume different things. So that makes it's complicated. But there is a theory of economics that predicts, that allow us to understand how this conjunction, this assemblage of consumers and producers behave in order to generate a given outcome. Biodiversity is the same. And in fact, the formula, if you like, is Einstein's formula of relativity. So we know that the energy is equal to mass times a constant squared, which means basically that energy equal to mass. And that is the currency of biodiversity. That is the currency of the planet. And it can be summed up into this expression. Biological metabolism is the rate of exchange of energy among organisms. And it's very simple. We all have learned that in school. We have the sun. The sun provides the solar energy, and that solar energy is used by plants together with water and some minerals to generate a chain reaction of organisms that feed on that energy. So essentially, there's the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy, and that chemical energy is what life uses, including ourselves. We only recently have managed to somehow, and still very timidly, disconnect ourselves from this cycle. We all have used throughout the history of humankind what we call chemical energy from plants, fuel, and even the fossil fuels based on carbon. They are all based on metabolism, on the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy by plants. And if you like to see that on a map, that's what happens every year. That's our planet Earth generating, transforming chemical energy from the sun. And what we see is the amount of gross primary production being generated by the different parts of the planet as the time passes throughout a year. If we have a fixed picture of how much energy is generated, how much chemical energy is generated by plants, that's what you have. Most of it is generating around the tropics because there's no seasons in terms of like temperature, the sun all over the year, and there's a lot of water. The two ingredients, the most important ingredients you need to generate stuff, biological stuff. And in fact, some conservationists will say, well, yeah, but metabolism and the amount of stuff that is generating by plants and then other animals is not equated to biodiversity. But in fact, if you look at this, Can you go back, please? Okay, thank you. If you look at this map here in the bottom, that's a map of species richness, a standard measure of biodiversity. And just visually, it correlates pretty much well with the map of net primary production. So then there's a related concept, which is social metabolism. And social metabolism is what we, as society, generate to go to our day-to-day lives. And as I said, only recently we've disconnected ourselves from the carbon cycle, and we have nuclear energy, wind energy, solar energy, which are disconnected from that history of dependence on plant-generated energy. And so social metabolism has been increasing enormously. And there's a law in ecology that there are also laws, the Castello law, that relates the body mass of an organism to the amount of energy that it consumes. So for example, a dog that has a mass of about 10 kilos, the dog would have a metabolism transformed into a unit of energy, of power, of watts, of about 80 watts. A human with about 80 kilos would have 120 watts of power. A hunter-gatherer with his social metabolism, in addition to his own biological metabolism, would be burning fuel, would be using some tools and cutting down some trees. So for his comfort and his day-to-day life, the social metabolism would be slightly higher than its body mass. And then you have the bull, the rhino, the elephant, and then you have the social metabolism of the agriculturalist in the Neolithic, and the social metabolism of the industrial man, and the North American, which, as we know, is the one that have a greater carbon footprint in the planet. So if you actually relate our social metabolism, individual social metabolism, with body mass, we're talking about each of us having a weight of about 10,000 kilos. So that's our footprint, our day-to-day footprint. So if we like to imagine what is a world of 9 billion people, 9 billion people is not a world with 9 billion people, it's about a world with 9 billion King Kongs, because that's the sort of body mass that you would expect for this imaginary creature. When you start to sum up this to provide you a summary, you can think of global land biosphere, and I'm not including the ocean here. We have a potency of about 150 terawatts. 10,000 years ago, our consumption was equal to that little point here on the map, was basically half of New York City. Whole humankind, that was the type of consumption we were having. Pre-industrial era still had a very relatively small impact, basically about 6 times New York. Finally, in the modern era, we have a consumption, a use of energy through our social metabolism, about 17% of the biosphere, which is equivalent to the whole energy process through the Amazon rainforest. Now, if you think about the future, of course, the future is uncertainty, but there are scenarios. And United Nations scenario for 2050 predicts that there will be 48 terawatts compared to the 27 now, which would amount for about 32%. We would appropriate with our use of energy, appropriate about 32% of all biosphere, which is about all of the tropical rainforests. If everyone was consuming like the Chinese are, that's what we would have, 60 terabytes, about 40% of the biosphere. And if everyone was consuming like the North Americans are, that's the picture, 120% of the biosphere, which is completely unsustainable. Well, the others are also unsustainable because they mean that we would be consuming all of the energy that life is generating. So there's an issue. If you use metabolism as this currency of biodiversity, of life, we know that as we consume more metabolism, we have greater impact. We have increased consumption, which leads to overexploitation, exploitation of fisheries, game, agriculture, and we have secondary effects, if you like climate change, ocean acidification, pollution, plastics, and etc. Now people are talking about, there's an issue of area as well. Metabolism correlates pretty well with everything we have in biodiversity, but there are some things that are better correlated with area, and extinction risk is one of them. So we're now talking, and that's the topic of the discussion that we're going to have today, about the quality of the metabolism. In a way, we can reduce our footprint by changing the way we consume and trying to build a circular economy rather than a linear economy. I'm a simple-minded person, and to understand complex issues, I like to simplify them as well as possible. And I echo Jorge's call for a systemic approach to the world problems. And I like very much this way of formulating the problem. So on the one hand, we have a supply problem, the rate with which the biosphere regenerates. And we have the stock issue, natural capital, the amount of natural capital and how fast it regenerates. And then we have a demand problem, which it's defined on the numerator by the amount of consumption, and consumption is defined by the number of consumers times the quantity of consumption per consumer, the consumption per capita, divided by the efficiency with which we use our resources and generate side problems. If you like, if we had, this would be up on the top, we'd have the amount of natural capital and its regeneration rate, and then we would have the amount of use of those resources. If this is bigger than the flow, we're gonna be depleted with the resources. So the challenge, of course, is to inverse the signal here and have less demand than we have of supply. Now, this equation, I would challenge anyone to say, well, this is not exactly like that. It is exactly like that. So that sums up our problem very, very well. And it's because it's a mathematical formula, it's objective. And there's only two ways to reduce that value on the left. One is to interfere with the numerator, and the other one is to interfere in the denominator. And politically, this has different people look at this equation in different ways. There hasn't been much debate on how we deal with the N, the number of consumers. Only China really had a policy to reduce human population, and of course, China is a dictatorship, so that's probably easier there. Then the Y, which is the amount of consumption per capita, is the agenda of some of the green movements, the anti-capitalist movements. If you were in the COP26, there was the COP inside the COP and there was the COP outside the COP. And the COP outside the COP is about this Y here. And then we have what we mostly be talking here, which is how we improve this value here and increase efficiency so that we reduce our impact per unit of consumption. And there's of course going to be always a limit. You can't grow indefinitely the numerator, and there should be somewhere, we should be hitting somewhere a limit as to the efficiency of our production and consumption. So mathematically, we should be talking about reducing the numerator and increasing the denominator. The question, of course, politically is how. How are you doing? Well, today we had the opening by the Minister, and he referred to the great decoupling, which essentially means that we are now growing in terms of GDP faster than we are emitting carbon, although we are still increasing the amount of carbon, which is the blue line. What he didn't mention, and is often overlooked, is that this red line here, it's our impact in terms of material footprint. We may be reducing our carbon emission because we are transforming our economy to that goal, but that is being somehow done at a cost of increase of impact in terms of the input of material, other types of material. And that's the global share of CO2 emissions. And you can see that Portugal has a very nice position in yellow there. And you can see that the bad guys is China, United States, Australia, India, Russia, etc. But when you actually see the same picture in terms of the carbon that is emitted through imports, the picture changes. The other one is production. We are producing at low carbon footprint, but that's because we are importing from elsewhere in parts of the world that they don't adhere to the same standards. China now looks much better than it did, and Portugal looks much worse. So what I think as a provocation for the debate, I think we should avoid doing what this drunken man is doing there. So the drunken man is looking for a coin that he lost, and the policeman asks him, so did you drop it here? And he said, no, I dropped it over there. But why are you looking at it here then? Well, because the light is here. We should avoid doing that. Thank you very much.
Obrigada ao Miguel Araújo, que fugiu, mas penso que vai participar aqui também na conversa que segue, ou não? Pensei que agora pensava, chega, já não me apetece falar mais, já tínhamos perdido um dos participantes e depois íamos ter que escolher um ao calhas no público, podia ser muito chato para algum de vocês, podia ser uma má surpresa, mas nada disso, não temos mais surpresas a partir de agora. Começo por chamar a moderadora da próxima conversa, é a Carla Tomás, jornalista do Expresso, aqui está a Carla. A ela juntar-se-ão o Nuno Lacasta, presidente da Agência Portuguesa do Ambiente, e também, remotamente, Eva Zabei, que é Executive Director da Business for Nature, e que vamos ver aparecer ali daqui a nada. Relembro que estamos a falar de planeta e de respeitar os seus limites.
Onde é que nos quer? Estamos fora? Estamos aqui, no meio? Miguel ali?
Sim, nós somos só três.
Sentas no meio?
Não, porque eu sou deste lado.
Então.
Ficam vocês aqui.
Mas ali há de ser alguém, não é? Portanto...
Ficam aqui no meio. Good afternoon. We have a wonderful presentation by Miguel Araújo, and now we are going to talk about King Kongs and our excess of consumption and the planet and how to respect the planetary boundaries. That's the theme of this second panel. I have with me Miguel Araújo, full professor of biogeography at Abertura University, Nuno Lacasta, president of Portuguese Agency for the Environment, and online it will be Eva Zabei, Business for Nature Executive Director. Hi, Eva, and welcome. Well, okay. Well, as Miguel said a few minutes ago, we are acting as King Kongs in this planet. And in the middle of this century will be 9 million or 10 billion. And if we keep consuming as King Kongs, not even 2 planets would be necessary for humanity survives. But however, humanity is reaching the limit of the sustainable use of natural resources earlier and earlier. This year, the Overshoot Day in Portugal took place on May 13th. Living like this, we would need more than 2 Earths already. But we don't have a planet B, and Mars is no solution. Our current levels on patterns of production and consumption are jeopardizing natural resources and other essential balances of biosphere. Of the 9 planetary boundaries defined to keep the planet and life on the planet in good conditions have been crossed. Climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change as deforestation, and biogeochemical cycles. These red lines jeopardize the planetary system in the long term and are threatening the climate system. Limiting Earth's warming to 1.5 Celsius degrees is one of them. And we have 8 years, not 10, because we are almost in 2022, to achieve those goals. 11 days ago, we had the COP26, and it was approved, the Glasgow Climate Pact. It was said it is not perfect, but perfection is enemy of good. And that 1.5 degrees goal is still alive, but its pulse is weak. So I start to ask both of you and Eva, if do you think the pulse is still beating when we think about the 1.5 degrees goal, and it will be beating next year at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh? Wants to start? Maybe the ladies is there. Okay. Eva, do you want to answer this?
Great, thank you so much. It's super to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. And it's so funny, the reference to Hong Kong, because I feel so big on the screen right now compared to you. So anyway, that's the joke. That's the ultimate joke. But thank you also for the opportunity. So is the pulse still beating? I would say yes. In fact, I would say it's stronger than it was a couple of years ago. Nature is on the agenda. At climate COP26. It was everywhere. And I would encourage us to not be too cynical about some of the discussions, because when you look at the detailed text, even if it has been watered down in some places, the signal is still clearly there to investors, to regulators, to businesses, that we need to increase that action. Of course, we didn't go as far as we wanted, and we need even more action. COP26 demonstrated for businesses we need to be held accountable for our actions and our impacts on the ground, and we need to be open to taking responsibility and engaging with others.
Thank you. Miguel.
I think today, maybe tomorrow it will feel different, but today I cannot avoid not being cynical a little bit about the COPs. It's COP26. It means that there has been another 26 COPs. And if you look at the amounts of carbon emissions that have been sent to the atmosphere since the COP1 was held in Berlin, there was no visible change in the rate. So objectively, just by looking at what's happening, of course there's lots of big words, and that's fine, but the results are still not visible. Now, the future, of course, I believe it will change, but we're still not there. And to not be completely cynical, I think the COPs, they have an important role. I mean, it's not like we should not have them. I think it's very important to have them. It's very important. These agreements are very important because they contribute to the building of a collective understanding of the problem and a collective understanding of the solutions to the problem. But because there are no binding targets, and every country do whatever they want to do in the end, there's a big risk of the free riding problem that some big countries, if they don't want to follow the agreed paths because of their own thinking about how they can benefit from that. Like if you can think of India, for example, and even China. There's the impact of what you are doing in your own country is going to be small. So I think end of the day, we have to, the multilateral context within which these discussions are held is very important. It has to continue, but in order to move forward, we need unilateral thinking as well. So we need to every one of us need to think hard and harder about how we can be part of the solutions. And that is true for every individual company, any individual person, but also, and because we are in Europe, I think we should have, in terms of the regulators, we should have a very bold action in terms of modifying or affecting the mood of the market. And I think we have the power to do that. For example, carbon taxes on entrance to European Union would solve some of the problems, or address some of the problems I mentioned about the last maps that I showed. If it was more expensive to import a product from China that is produced cheaply because they are using carbon like hell, and we are decommissioning our carbon and having a cost of investment and sometimes even added costs on production, our products are going to be more expensive, right, in terms of dollars, but are going to be less expensive in terms of the impact on metabolism. So, I mean, that cost, the metabolic cost of our consumption has to be incorporated in price. If the Chinese don't want to do it by 2030, okay, we impose a tax, and they will do it anyway because we have 500 million customers that are buying their products. So I think European Commission should play a much harder role there. And soft diplomacy is important, but we have to pass through some acts and take ourselves some leading by example, but also forcing the others to follow us.
Thank you, Miguel. Nuno, and what do you think are the main challenges so we can achieve the goal of 1.5 next year?
Well, I think I'd like to bring out three messages. But first, I must say that I feel intimidated. And I feel intimidated because it's not very often that one gets to sit in a panel with a Prémio Pessoa, which, of course, Miguel has been. And this is very important for anybody working on environmental matters, sustainability matters, because it's the first person with this specific training which has gotten this absolutely essential prize in Portugal. So I'd like to state formally that I'm intimidated by you, Miguel. Although we know each other for many years, you've reached another level. But the three messages I'd like to bring out from the COP are the following. The first one is that I would place myself in between both Eva and Miguel, in that, yes, it is true that around 35% of global emissions have occurred in the last 30 years. And this is because a lot of people were born and began consuming in the last 30, 40 years. And that is, of course, the emergence of countries like China and India and Brazil and Indonesia that have a lot more people than Europe does. By the same token, Europe began and North America began reducing population, therefore overall output in terms of emissions in a relative scale. More Europe than the United States, but still on a longer scale, emissions have stabilized or even come down. This means that as a result, we need to look at the last 5 years. And if we look back at the last 5 years, I would argue that things have begun changing. And things have begun changing because this is no longer an issue between, say, a tug of war between so-called developed and developing countries. It's become an issue that society as a whole has started embracing, and companies have also begun embracing. I'm not saying this just because we're in an environment which is full of companies. I'm saying this because a lot of the companies in this gathering and many, many other gatherings have begun having objective, concrete climate targets. And in fact, as we all know, some Portuguese companies are quite well ranked in that regard. In a way, we do live in a bubble in this country and also in Europe. And this means that we need to harness that potential. We need to bring it towards the formal international process, because as we've learned out of Glasgow, at this rate of growth, global emissions, we may still very well be at the 1.9 to 2.3, 2.4 degrees Celsius global average warming. And that's, of course, well beyond 1.5. And this is why Glasgow was so important. And this is my second message. It was so important, not because of the technocratic, academic, policy-making sort of angle around the 1.5 degrees, frankly, as fundamental as it is, also a political angle. If we were not to keep alive, quote-unquote, the 1.5 degree, we would have, at Glasgow, condemned to extinction several countries. And as you may imagine, politically, that would be tricky, to say the least. But most importantly, what we needed to do is to ensure that an amount of carbon onto the atmosphere in the next 5 years that may be released was kept to a level which would still allow us in the midterm to not go beyond the 2 degrees. This is why I reiterate this point. Governments, for sure, at different pace. We've heard China announcing a 2060 carbon neutrality target, India 2070. I would bet that these numbers will improve over the next 10 to 15 years for many, many reasons, which we have no time to address here. But I would also argue that the signal for companies was, don't stop. Don't think that because we haven't yet reached all those goals, that you can now relax and go back to business as usual. That was not the signal from Glasgow. And this is very important, because this means that this notion of energy transition, this notion of ensuring that we keep on reducing emissions, looking, for instance, at global trade patterns, for sure. This is an issue which obviously Europe will need to address going forward. This means that we have a lot of work. Also, if you look into the nitty-gritty of Glasgow, one more minute, and I'm already, I guess, cannibalizing the next panel on COP26 takeouts. Because we finished in key rules to work towards carbon and non-carbon market type offsets, without these, we wouldn't be able to even grasp 1.5 degrees. And so this technocratic side of Glasgow is very important, because if we hadn't put these rules in place, if we hadn't brought up coalitions on forestry, this addresses also the link with biodiversity, on car emissions, on methane, meaning that we have a different landscape, not only the formal agreements, but also side agreements, then I would be cynical. So as a result, I'm afraid I cannot be.
Yeah, well, there are different visions. Some are positive, other more negative, and some cynical. Let's see what we'll have in the next year in Sharm el-Sheikh. If it's only blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg says or not. But Miguel, in your speech, you spoke about the complexity of biodiversity and the difficulty to connect or interconnect biodiversity and climate change. They are interconnected, but why is it so difficult to make the world looking to them on the same level, and why it needs one another? Because if we protect ecosystems and biodiversity, we are slowing down climate change. Can you elaborate more about this?
Yes, we're slowing down. Is still not, or not exacerbating. Most of the carbon on Earth is not in the atmosphere. Most of the carbon is in the biosphere, in the soil and in the ocean. And if we do things wrong, that carbon might be transferred to the atmosphere with consequences that are even hard to begin to imagine. So priority number one is not to unleash an uncontrollable experiment of release of some of this carbon that is stored in the biosphere. And a lot of it is stored in boreal forests, a lot of it is stored in rainforests in the tropics, a lot of it is stored in peatlands. So there's several systems that hold a disproportionate percentage of the carbon in the biosphere. And it's, to be honest, our level of understanding of the carbon cycle is still very, very poor. We're still only now starting to understand how there's some shifts in, for example, an ecosystem becoming a sink to being a source. And sometimes a small tipping point in the dynamics of those systems can switch an ecosystem from being a source to becoming a sink. So that is very complicated. Yeah, I mean, I think we have failed, I think, collectively to convey that message efficiently. And I hope it will improve soon. I'm co-responsible for that. One thing is how biodiversity will mitigate or helps to mitigate climate change. And that's, I think we now have a general understanding of that. And the other one is how climate change affects biodiversity. So it's a two-way interaction system. And so we cannot just address one side of the problem. We have to address both, which means increasing the size of conservation area, protected areas. And some of you might know in this COP15 that I mentioned earlier on, one of the topics in the agenda that has been addressed also by the European Commission is to increase the size of protected areas in Europe, both in the sea and the land, to 30% by 2030. I think that's a very important target. We, for example, in Portugal are about 23% if we consider the Natura 2000 network and the protected areas. So we still have to have 7% of new additional protected areas. And there's a second target, which is to effectively ensure the strict conservation of 10% of land and sea, which for Portugal is a very difficult target to achieve, because we virtually have 0% strict conservation according to the criteria set out by the European Commission. So we have to go from 0 to 10. And the big question is how, because we're dealing with private land, and private land that is often allocated to different uses of conservation. So people are now looking into it, and there's probably about 4% of public land that could be reallocated to conservation, but there will still be 6% of new areas that would need to be, and this is my call to you, private sector. I think in the US that is already commonplace, but I think we need to have a significant increase in privately owned protected areas, and make that create a business model around conservation in Europe as well. So that is a big topic I'm working currently on, and I think by early January there's going to be more news about it. but this is a big target. And then there's the restoration. We're starting now the decade on ecological restoration, and it's not just about conserving what's left, but it's also bringing back some nature back. And that's bringing back like the rewilding agenda of bringing back nature to nature, more nature to nature, but there's also bringing back nature to some farmland and bringing back nature to cities, not just because of biodiversity and climate change, but mainly because of health of people. There's more and more people living in cities, and if that is going to continue to be so, we're going to be like 70% globally of urban people in the world. And in order to maintain that connection with nature, we have to have nature also next to our doorstep. So that's part of the agenda too.
Thank you, Miguel. Eva, what are your expectations about the COP 15 of biodiversity and the connection with the climate change, and about the nature-based solutions for climate change, people and biodiversity? What is needed to be done, in your opinion, to go and step forward?
Thanks so much, Carla. So a lot needs to be done, but we are making progress. And just on a reflection on the conversation that's just taken place around COP26, I was thinking that there's a bit of a parallel in terms of social norms evolving to ultimately become regulation and new norms. With the way in Glasgow there was the outside, people talked about inside and outside the venue, but actually within the venue there was this whole area of exhibition which was like a conference fair, and then there was the actual negotiations taking place, which seemed completely distant and physically was also different. So I think we have this same evolution between activist, shifting consumer behavior, and then regulation, and that's why there's a timing issue, because even though social norms are changing today, they're not going fast enough to get into regulation, and that will take time. And I think what was also said about Europe playing a role in terms of, well, if Europe can't do it, who can? Europe is demonstrating leadership in multiple forms. So you were talking about, so COP15, the COP15 is going to be hugely impactful in terms of hopefully agreeing, adopting a transformative, ambitious, actionable framework, which will be the equivalent of the Paris Agreement, but for nature. We work, Business for Nature is a global coalition of organizations around the world, including BCSD Portugal, but also a number of NGOs that work with companies to raise that ambition. And collectively, we're providing that leading business voice into the CBD process, into the Convention on Biological Diversity process. So what we've been doing is at the high level, brought forward that leading business CEO in particular voice to give policymakers at the highest level the confidence that they should be adopting an ambitious framework. And then also in parallel, working at the technical level on the specific texts that are being negotiated and providing direct input to the negotiators. So this is a very positive, progressive, we're calling for a strong mission in the framework, which aligns with what Professor was talking about in terms of simplifying what biodiversity actually means. We also need the 1.5 equivalent of climate, but for nature and biodiversity. What is emerging is the nature positive terminology, which is very helpful in terms of raising the ambition to be aligned with net zero emissions. At the same time, we can't pretend that we have all of the answers to get to that nature positive in every single action. That is not an excuse, and we must act already now. Nature positive means halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. So we have more nature in 2030 than we have now. That illustrates the level of ambition and urgency to act and should be reflected in the Global Biodiversity Framework. People sometimes think, well, what is a mission? How important is it? But we've seen that from Paris, the Paris Agreement on Climate, having that political certainty gives companies the real mandate to invest, innovate, and shift business models, which they would not necessarily have with a vague framework that does not provide that direction. We're also emphasizing in what we're calling on for the COP15 process, the elimination and redirection of harmful subsidies. We think subsidies is something that we need to dig into this elephant in the room quite seriously, and that's one that, as we know, will be huge in terms of filling the financing gap. But we also need to value and embed nature in all decision-making and disclosure. So I think that's where some of the targets around the role that businesses can play in measuring, valuing, and disclosing their impacts and dependencies is hugely important to strengthen the accountability system. So nature-based solutions, and I will probably have to stop, because I can't sense the energy in the room. I can't tell, even though I look like Hong Kong here, I can't tell if everyone is falling asleep in the room. So it's very tricky. I wish I could be there with you and have some bacalao, I have to say. But the final thing I wanted to say on nature-based solutions and at COP26, what was really encouraging to me was that everyone was understanding nature-based solutions as being high quality, that are not only to help capture carbon, but that it needs to preserve biodiversity, manage water properly, include livelihoods, etc., etc. It's not only about climate mitigation, but also about climate adaptation. And that may seem obvious for people in the room, but actually in the climate discussions, it's the first time that we've been having that consistency and fluency in the narrative around nature-based solutions. I also think that we should not be shy of having the challenging conversations around offsets, and that offsets have been now connected to nature-based solutions, but that there is no dispute around first needing to decarbonize as much as possible, and it's only the residual emissions that can then be offset, hopefully none at all. And some companies like Walmart have committed to net zero without using offsets.
Okay.
So over to you, sorry.
Thank you, Eva. Nuno, in Portugal, what are we doing about nature-based solutions and biodiversity? And well, afterwards, I will try to ask the audience if they have any questions, and also if they are on the path of what you said, Eva, and not just on greenwashing path. But no.
Well, perhaps we might have some role reversing here, because as I was listening to the other two comments, I was thinking about the following. Some 10 years ago, and who knows, I'm the cynical now. Some 10 years ago, when we were in these gatherings, because there were these gatherings to talk about climate change, I would often spend most of my talk explaining the basic facts about climate change. As you've seen, we didn't do that today, and we no longer need to sort of convince ourselves, and certainly the audience, about the urgency and the impact of climate change. Today, we heard Miguel go through an equivalent presentation to some of the presentations we used to hear about biodiversity. And I want to address that, and as a result, answer your question. Because the obvious conclusion from your presentation and from the facts is that we failed dramatically on biodiversity protection, including in this country. And I will say why. That figure of 23% protected areas which you've mentioned, it's been around for a long time. At the Environment Agency, we produce the annual State of Environment report. And that's the easiest ficha, the easiest page to really write, because it's self-written, this number hasn't changed much. Now, yes, of course, we have recently designated a couple of areas, and clearly as we move forward, we will be designating ocean areas, and of course, we will jump to the top of the list because we have a lot of ocean, as we know, in Portugal. But the bottom line question is, biodiversity, in a certain, to a certain extent in this country, has a bad rep. It has a bad rep because the way we've spatial planned ourselves over the last 40 years has been absolutely schizophrenic. It is by far our most poignant, most important development challenge. It's the fact that we do not have the tradition of spatial planning which every other European country has, perhaps with the exception of some Balkan countries. In other words, culturally, everybody in this room and online will recognize their own country in the sense that we spread ourselves around the territory as we so choose. And this is a challenge to protect biodiversity, because as a result, we began building roads, urbanizations, tourist urbanizations, which have effectively fragmented habitats. And as a result, our level on the ground of protection hasn't really increased that much, other than territory which has been effectively abandoned. And we need to change the paradigm. We need to start investing seriously on biodiversity protection. And this is, if you look back at the last few years, and I'm not really proud about saying this, but perhaps the ministers mentioned this in the speech this morning, is that we finally began investing public monies on biodiversity. Next year, the plan is to invest even more so. This brings me back to nature-based solutions, where I believe that we're doing quite a bit. Certainly, for instance, in terms of river restoration, we now have the first generation of restoration projects, actually a lot of them as a result of forest fires. But, you know, the money has been put and we've restored a lot of rivers, and we have now about 100 million euros maybe coming, public money, to in the next financing cycle to keep on working on river restoration. But here's where we need to do better. We need to look at these projects, which are essentially environmental and biodiversity projects, and link them with agriculture projects. I was saying this the other day, that a lot of what farmers do is river protection, but they don't know that. Or for that matter, they do know that because, of course, they need to put trees to protect farmland from winds. It is in their interest, ultimate interest, to clean up not the rivers but the streams. And what we have begun doing is to articulate the methodology of nature-based solutions on river restoration, which I've mentioned, with the actual methodologies that farmers employ with common agriculture money on a daily basis to also restore. It's what we call in Portuguese galerias ripícolas. I don't even know how to translate that into English. But we need to bring these together, because if we do that, arguably the financial flow on this will be much more than these 100 million, probably twice as much. And eventually I'll talk about the role of business in this as well.
Sorry, you spoke about biodiversity, and you both spoke about that we have 23% of protected areas, but we are not protecting them seriously. Now, Nuno spoke about agriculture. For example, if we think about Parque Natural Sudoeste Alentejano e Costa Vicentina, sorry, in English, Natural Park of Southwest Alentejo and Costa Vicentina, we have a huge amount of greenhouse houses with intensive agriculture, and we are not protecting two of the planetary boundaries, biodiversity and water, fresh water, with this agro-industry on this natural park. So we look a little bit schizophrenic when we say we must protect, but at the other way we think about profit and economy and GDP, and so we permit this kind of agriculture.
Well, that's a very interesting topic indeed, but it's one which we need to use another word to look at the complexity, or for that matter, the complication around it. And I'm going to be specific here. This issue has turned up in the public attention, not because of biodiversity, to be sure. It's come up to the public attention because the public, a different sort of public, began realizing that perhaps for landscaping reasons, this was something which one would need to think twice. I think there we do indeed need to look at two aspects, and I'm going to be focusing on one because we're working on that. It's the aspect of water use. The bottom line discussion is the following. We need to look at the area of existing and or foreseen greenhouse installments, and decide and determine the quantity of water which can be used. We can discuss the source, and as you may imagine, I'm prepared to do that. But the quantity of water that can be used for all that production, and essentially allocate that quantity to the farmers' associations, also in discussion with the municipalities, and say, this is the water that you can use. Within that, let's say, bubble, what you do with it, we will be monitoring, we'll be paying attention, but within that bubble, there is some flexibility. But this is the maximum amount of water which you're allowed to use. And that's what we began doing in the context of the Alentejo River Basin Management Plan, which is being prepared. And I would invite everybody to look at that at public discussion when we put it out, because it will be exactly that. There's some technical issues around it, which perhaps for another audience, but that's something which I think we should be focusing on. This will mean we'll have tough choices, because the likelihood of players thinking that this kind of allocation is enough is not quite high. But this is a debate we need to have in our society as much as any other society.
Thank you, Nuno. Miguel, do you want to say something about this kind of schizophrenic approach we have?
Well, I think we have to recognize that Portugal is somehow unusual in an international context, in the sense that the greatest majority of protected area land is privately owned. In most countries, there's some coexistence between privately owned protected areas and publicly owned protected areas, but the largest national parks, the largest areas are public. And that makes sense, because we're talking about a preservation of public goods. Biodiversity has elements of private good, in the sense that some of the biodiversity can be exploited, but there's also a great deal of biodiversity value that is not object to transaction. It has enormous value. It provides clean air, it provides soil, it provides prevention of risks against erosion. So it has lots of public good consequences that cannot go into the market. So it makes sense to have large areas of public land allocated to conservation and managed for the maintenance and restorations of those public goods. And that is an anomaly of Portugal that I think we should have to address at some point. Perhaps the state should actively be engaged in buying up land. An alternative to that is that the third sector and the private sector steps up and say, we have a corporate responsibility to a better world, and we're going to contribute to this 10%, to this 30%. We will be buying land, and we will be managing for protection, of course, with some business model associated. I mean, if you visit Kruger Park, Yellowstone, you see there's business around those concepts. And in fact, I've been looking at some figures, and I doubt they are really accurate, but they give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about. We spent about $10 billion in managing nature around the world. I think it's billion, not trillion, but it does matter for this purpose. And we get, in terms of revenue from tourism, 600 billion. And I'm not talking about public goods, I'm talking about just transactions. So it's a good investment to protect nature, to manage nature, just for business-oriented goals. So there's a lot of scope for for increasing investment in those sides. And another figure which I think is useful is that half the global tourism in protected areas occurs in Europe. Half. I mean, there's lots of tourism in Africa, lots of tourism in Asia and in the United States, but about half of it, it's allocated. It happens within Europe. And Europe is the only place, except for Poland, in the world where you don't pay fees to enter protected areas. So basically, it's a public good you can access that, nobody pays anything. It's taxpayers' money, which leads to underinvestment in the protection of nature and the disaster we have in Portugal, because on top of it, this land is used by the local manager to do other things. They don't really care. I mean, it's not the role of a private landowner to protect public goods, right? They want to take profit out of their land, which is perfectly reasonable. They just don't have probably either the vision or the size, because if you want to have a proper nature reserve or park, you have to have a big area. And in fact, the costs of management, they decrease with area. The greater the size of a protected area, the cheaper it is to manage, because then the humans stop being the engineers and the architects of that landscape. You have the predators, you have the herbivores, they manage the biomass, they generate diversity, their organization is the park, right? And they manage it proficiently. But you have to have some size in order to get there. Yeah. So I think, just to finish, and to wrap up the Portugal issue, the government has spent a lot of attention in regulation of privately owned land to reduce the negative impacts of economic activities on the land, and which generates a tension between the duty to conserve biodiversity and the right to use the resources in the land. So that tension is unresolved and will not be resolved unless we change our model. And that you can either go away, like the international model of publicly managing land for the sake of the public goods, or privately managing this land. But if you privately manage this land, you have to have a big a business model, which can be partly helped by regulators. There's a user pays and polluter pays principles that can be harnessed towards the goal of managing nature.
Thank you, Miguel. Eva, I have one last question, because we are ending our time, and I would like to know what business is very important to act for nature also, but is business looking at how to make nature positive? What do you think about this? Do you have good examples to talk us about?
Thanks so much. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, I have to say, and I would like to share a few points afterwards about valuing nature and the systems transformation that's necessary. But to answer your question first, I mean, we're seeing huge momentum in the business community over the past 18 months. Before that, most companies, maybe in this country, you would understand biodiversity and the value of water, but around the world generally, most companies were quite ignorant of the importance and the foundational role that biodiversity and all ecosystem services play, that they not only impact but also depend on. The reality is that at least, over half of the world's GDP is at moderate or high risk due to nature loss, and so the material impact that can have on business is becoming clearer. We now have more than 1,000 companies that are urging governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. So we're seeing the momentum and we're seeing the leadership, and what companies need to do now is assess, commit, act, and advocate. Assess, understand all the material impacts and dependencies on nature, to act in the most appropriate ways. Is not only about, in your office space, putting a few green roofs on. That's not enough. Look at your full business, your full value chain. 2 is commit, so make sure you're making science-based, ambitious, bold commitments, and using and leveraging the science-based targets for nature guidance. 3 is act. That means reducing your negative impacts as much as you can, avoiding wherever you can, but then going beyond, working towards regenerative, restorative business models and approaches. And then 4 is advocate, which is starting to change the rules of the game. Companies need to raise their voice and tell policymakers, actually, if you do adopt this ambitious policy, we are ready to be profitable and successful within it. At the same time, what I see is we need to be clear in our language between financial flows and economic value. So the Dasgupta review that Professor Rahul just mentioned and referenced earlier, it's all economic estimates. So even though we understand the full economic value that ecosystems provide, they're not yet adequately accounted for in the financial systems that we operate. Otherwise, there wouldn't even be a decision, because the cheapest product would also be, by default, the most sustainable, because you'd have already included all of these aspects in it. So I think we're on a shift here, and what collectively we can do is de-risk some of these innovations and efforts that companies are making, because somehow there is not only benefits for going too fast forward and doing too much on the nature positive journey right now, because it's not rewarded financially yet. Yet is the important word there. So you were asking for some examples really quickly. Unilever has committed to a deforestation-free supply chain by 2023, so that's a couple years away, as have other companies. They have also committed to protect and regenerate 1.5 million hectares of land, forests, and oceans by 2030. You'll see more companies also committing to protecting, restoring sustainably, using significant portions of land. We also have companies in the financial sector that are including the value of natural capital in their risk portfolios. So BNP Paribas is one, but there are many others. And then I think on a land, more specific level, I would say Natura & Co., which is a cosmetics company. They work with local communities in the Amazon, where they actually pay the people more to keep the trees standing for this special, now I've forgotten the name of the plant, but the tree has, the grains of the tree, the seeds of the tree, have really strong moisturizing properties that they can use in their products. And what the local community used to do is chop down the trees and sell the timber, and now the company is paying them more to keep the trees standing and then buys the seeds from them. So those are relatively simple explanations of how you can actually create and embed the value of nature in some business models. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eva. Now I ask the audience if anyone has any questions for Nuno and Miguel and Eva? Anyone?
Yes, I have a question to the panel. I think it was interesting to understand that there is a line between the public and the private sector that are leading these changes towards sustainability, but it would be interesting to understand. Sometimes, as you say, the public sector need to step forward in order to take action to protect some areas, for example, or and on the opposite side, the private sector react in a way they don't want to take actions on sustainability to protect their interests. I think it will be interesting to understand if there are any other solution except regulations or raising awareness of these companies to take better actions. And especially in an environment like in Portugal, where most of the companies are small and medium-sized, and they are not probably aware, or they don't understand that let's say the environment around them can be impactful also positively for their businesses. And I would like to ask if you have any ideas in which there are other ways in which can be implemented solutions that are not just about regulations or raising awareness of these companies.
Thank you. Nuno, please.
Let me try to sort of summarize a little bit of what we've heard, because I think it would be in the interest of the audience, because we've heard a lot of things here. we haven't heard something which is already a trend in this country, and that is it's called co-management, co-gestão. This is a recent trend by which protected areas are going to be co-managed between the state and the municipalities. And in some situations, I also see other stakeholders coming through. I think this is an interesting development because the traditional so-called management approach to protected areas has been the state, and as Miguel said, that kind of raised a dilemma because the state managed what was not his or its, and it had nonetheless set aside these protected areas. So that's one trend. The other trend, and you have small examples in this country already, are private parks. And that's an issue because you have private parks in this country and 2 private parks, but initially they had a bad reputation. They were seen as theme parks, and I think this is very unfair. In fact, you have more than that, because if you look at also Zumarine in the Algarve, you begin having a different approach towards conservation, for sure. So this is something we need to explore, and I think goes in line of what you said earlier, Miguel. And I think with this, you have a third component. This is the message perhaps I'd like to leave to this audience of companies, and Eva mentioned it. To the extent we can, going forward, work on companies actually setting aside money for eventual purchasing of land, and I know the Nature Conservation Institute in this country is beginning a program, at the beginning stage, of a land purchase program. This is something I think we need to look into in this country going forward. And other countries have done so. But ultimately, we need to harness, for instance, the tourism sector, which potential for nature conservation is huge. You mentioned that figure. But this country's economy depends on tourism quite substantially, and it's likely to increase, and tourism is likely to migrate to a certain extent from the beach shore to inland. As it does so, we need to be smart in terms of new ways of managing these inland areas. Ironically, also because some of these tourists, they will have higher standards than some of the standards which we're used to. These are tourists that oftentimes care about litter. They don't enjoy the fact that they trash these protected areas. The issue of walking about is something which has an obvious economic potential, co-steering, and a few other activities, and I think we need to do a lot more in that front. And for that, we need more players. It's like, and this is a parenthesis, it's like what we're seeing, for instance, in the polymers and the biochemical industry. These are industries which are changing today because of climate change. They're taking up plastics and whatnot. I think we should do the same in terms of nature conservation. Bring more actors, have different management models, set aside private purchases, compensation. Sometimes if you build an urbanization in a city, why not compensate for planting forests elsewhere? Other people do that. We should begin doing that.
And besides compensating, maybe we should construct with more efficiently, so we don't spend so much energy, for example. And about business in general and consumption, we started speaking about the King Kongs. We all are. So we need to stop consuming so much, and companies should produce less. But profit is over everything.
Yeah. So. I think that's a huge discussion, but I mean, we don't have time.
We don't have time, yes.
I'll just like to stress two ideas. One, just to reinforce, and because we hear that there's lots of money to be made in nature conservation, both in Portugal and elsewhere. And I think that is an issue that should be looked at, not just because of the money issue, because of course drives the world, but also, principles also drive the world. But both money in terms of user pays, like tourism, but also in terms of offsetting, for example, carbon emissions. A big company can well manage a 10,000 hectares 20,000 hectares protected area, which in addition to having a business model of tourism and nature conservation associated with it, can also play an important role and a quantifiable role in terms of offsetting carbon emissions. And that has a market in itself, right? So I think there's lots of opportunities there to bring a climate and nature conservation policy together. The other thing to address the governmental side of it, I think there's a major need for a rethink in terms of the role of the state in doing nature conservation in privately owned land. You know, there's a role to buying land, as Carlos mentioned, but it's important to start. It's not just like that the state is managing biodiversity in the land that is not his or its, but also that it's evaluating its policies at the same time. So the state is regulating, is managing, and is evaluating. That needs to be separated. I think the practical side of nature conservation has to be, if it's in privately owned land, it has to be a contract made with the landowners, and that contract and the fulfillment of that contract has to be evaluated by the government with paying somehow and setting a favorable ecosystem for developing those actions. And if those roles are separated, I think we will gradually get out of the mess that we are in terms of nature conservation in Portugal.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Nuno. Eva, thank you very much. I think we are at the end of our time. All these themes would have much more to talk about, but the time is limited. So thank you very much to all, and I hope you will have a wonderful afternoon on the next panels. Thank you.
Obrigada a todos. Obrigada. Trago agora boas notícias. Vamos fazer uma pausa para almoço. A notícia importante que trago é que peço-vos que estejam aqui pontualmente às 2h30 para retomarmos aqui os trabalhos e os próximos painéis. E digo-vos também, para quem não souber, que há uma série de hipóteses para almoçar aqui nas redondezas. No próprio Parque Eduardo VII há um quiosque e à volta há uma série de sítios. Temos também o Ritz, para quem tiver vontade de gastar mais dinheiro ao almoço. Às 2h30 retomamos aqui os nossos trabalhos e vamos ainda aprender muita coisa durante a tarde. Obrigada.
Fez questão de bater.
Sobre